The Piney Grove Funeral Home. The air conditioning in the preparation room of the Piney Grove Funeral Home hummed with a low, mechanical permanence, a stark contrast to the thick Alabama heat pressing against the bricks outside. Butch Hampton, owner and chief operator, the town's unrefined, rough-around-the-edges final coordinator, a man who approaches the business of death with the blunt pragmatism of a diesel mechanic and the unexpected heart of a backwoods neighbor. Butch Hampton looks like a man built for a hunting blind, but somehow squeezed into a Sunday suit. At 58, he possesses a broad, thick-set frame and hands the size of country hams, calloused from years of working on stubborn engines and heavy vaults. His knuckles are perpetually stained with a hint of grease that no amount of industrial soap can quite shift. He refuses to wear the traditional three-piece charcoal numbers. Instead, Butch favors a slightly short-sleeved white dress shirt, a clip-on tie that is rarely perfectly centered, and a pair of dark slacks that look like they've seen their fair share of Alabama red mud. His hair is a chaotic, wire-brushed crop of iron gray. He doesn't glide through the viewing rooms, he tramps through them, his heavy work boots occasionally squeaking against the polished linoleum floors. "We're going to need the extra folding chairs from the basement, Ian," Butch said, his voice a smooth, low baritone. "The ones we bought after the high school state championship win in '98, every single one of them." "For one service?" Ian asked, looking up. "The chapel seats 200. "Piney Grove is coming," Butch replied. "When a pillar cracks, the whole porch shakes." They were preparing for the viewing of Miss Martha Grana Vance. In a town like Piney Grove, everyone was kin by proximity. She had been the high school's fiercest history teacher, the loudest alto in the Piney Grove church choir, and a woman who had ordered her morning biscuit from the Piney Grove Jack's drive-thru at exactly 6:45 a.m. for 40 years. By 2 p.m., the mechanics of grief were in full motion, and with them came the town's secrets. The side door chimed. It was Andrew and Sam, Martha's grandsons, looking entirely out of their depth in stiff, unfamiliar suits. Between them, they carried two massive, slightly wilted poinsettias. "We brought these," Andrew said, his voice cracking slightly. "Grana, well, she practically stole these from the church after the Christmas pageant last winter. Said they were too pretty to be left in an empty building. We thought they ought to be here." Butch smiled, a genuine crinkling expression. "I remember the deacon looking for those. Don't worry, boys. Your secret is safe in these walls. We'll put them right by the register book." As the afternoon wore on, the funeral home became a repository for the town's quiet truths. The flower arrangements arrived in waves, serving as a silent language of local politics and hidden history. A massive wreath of red roses arrived with a card signed, "From the class of '84, we finally finished the reading list." Later, a quiet delivery came from the back door, a massive box of fresh hot biscuits and sweet tea from Jack's. The delivery driver, a young girl named Kaylin who worked the night shift, handed them to Ian, her eyes rimmed with red. "The manager said the morning shift didn't feel right without making her order. We didn't know where else to put the grief, so we made biscuits." "It's the best tribute she could ask for," Ian said softly, setting the trays in the family lounge. By 5 p.m., the doors officially opened and the invisible threads connecting Piney Grove tightened. They came from every corner of the map. Principal Daniel from the Piney Grove School stood shoulder to shoulder with Ben, the mechanic who had kept Martha's ancient sedan running on hope and spare parts for a decade. The pews filled, then the folding chairs, until people were lining the mahogany hallways, spilling out onto the front porch, where the summer evening was finally beginning to cool. In the corner of the viewing room sat a row of residents from the Piney Grove nursing home, brought over in the facility van. Among them was an older man named Pappy, whose hands trembled as he held a program. Butch watched from the back as Pappy looked at Martha's casket, then down at an old, faded photograph he had pulled from his pocket, a picture of two teenagers sitting on the steps of the old schoolhouse before the world changed. No one else in the room knew the story of the summer of 1958, but Butch did. He had kept that confidence for 40 years. The tension in the room was palpable, but so was the comfort. Old feuds, the kind that started over property lines or forgotten high school slights, seemed to dissolve under the weight of the heavy floral scents and the shared hum of memories. People who hadn't spoken since the last town revival found themselves sharing a hymnal. As the clock struck 7, Preacher Cone stood at the podium, but before he could speak, a soft, spontaneous sound rose from the back of the room. It was the choir director, her voice steadying the crowd as she began to sing the old familiar verses of the town's favorite hymn. One by one, voices joined. The high schoolers in the back, the workers from Jack's still in their uniforms, the nurses from the home, and the families who had lived on Piney Grove's dirt roads for generations. The sound swelled, bouncing off the plaster walls, vibrating through the floorboards. Butch stood next to Ian by the heavy oak double doors, watching the town become a single, breathing organism. Look at them, Ian whispered, awestruck by the sheer volume of the crowd. How do you manage all of this, Grandpappy? How often does this happen every day? Butch placed a hand on his grandson's shoulder, his eyes reflecting the soft light of the chapel. We don't hold it for them, Ian, Butch said softly. We just built the house where they can finally lay it down. The Seminary of Sandy Soil. There are certain practical pastoral skills they neglect to include in the divinity school curriculum. They teach you how to parse Greek verbs, how to structure a three-point sermon, and how to comfort a grieving widow properly. But nowhere in the course catalog will you find Introduction to Graveyard Engineering and Casket Rescue. I learned that particular lesson the hard way during my very first pastorate, down in the deep, shifting, sandy soil of southeast Georgia, a sinking feeling. It was a hot afternoon, and we were conducting a standard graveside service. The family was gathered, the tissue boxes were deployed, and another local minister and I stood shoulder to shoulder near the edge of the grave, leading the final prayers. Now, Southeast Georgia's sand is notoriously uncooperative. It doesn't stay put. As the heavy vault and casket were being positioned over the opening, the ground beneath our feet decided it had endured enough gravity for one day. The sound, a sickening hollow schlook as the earth gave way. The crisis. Right there in the middle of the committal prayer, the sidewall of the grave began to cave inward. The casket started to tilt at a terrifying angle, threatening to capsize into a half-collapsed hole before we could even lower it. Before the family could fully process what was happening, the other minister and I dropped our Bibles, lunged forward, and caught the edge of the heavy structure, digging out. There we were, two green young preachers in our Sunday suits, muscles straining and sweat pouring, quite literally holding up the dead. We became the human retaining wall, keeping the entire service from turning into an absolute catastrophe. The funeral director, a man of immense practical crisis management, didn't panic. He looked at the tilting casket, looked at our straining faces, and realized he had exactly one move. He grabbed a shovel, climbed right down into the unstable pit beneath the casket, and started furiously throwing sand back out of the hole like a man possessed. For 5 minutes, the only sounds in that cemetery were the scraping of his shovel, our heavy breathing, and the stunned, wide-eyed silence of the grieving family. The tips of the trade. Against all mathematical odds, we managed to stabilize the ground, lower the casket straight and true, and conclude the service with as much dignity as we could muster. After the family finally dispersed, the other minister and I leaned against my car, brushing sand off our trousers and wiping our brows, completely exhausted. The funeral director walked up alongside us, looking entirely unfazed by his brief stint in the underworld. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his clip, and smoothly slipped a crisp $20 bill into each of our palms. He gave us a slow, knowing wink and said, "Boys, I know they didn't teach you that in seminary." It was the hardest $20 I ever earned in ministry, and to this day, whenever I stand on sandy ground, I make sure to keep my weight firmly on my heels. Hardly worth the trip. Down at the Piney Grove Funeral Home, the local undertaker, Butch Hampton, a man who prided himself on his impeccable, hushed bedside manner, ran straight into this brand of wisdom just before a service was set to begin. The deceased was a quiet soul who had lived a long, full life, and his widow, a sharp-witted lady of 96, was sitting in the front family room. She sat perfectly upright, surrounded by massive gladiolus wreaths, looking entirely unfazed by the room's somber gravity. Butch, the undertaker, adjusting his vest and speaking in that low, reverent tone reserved strictly for the immediate family, tiptoed over to her chair to finalize the last bits of paperwork. "Ma'am, just as we start the chapel service," he whispered, leaning in, "I need to verify one detail for the county record. How old was your husband?" "98," she replied, without missing a beat, her voice steady and clear. Then she looked the undertaker dead in the eye and added, "Just 2 years older than me." The undertaker, doing some quick mental math and trying to offer a polite, comforting compliment, smiled gently. "Well, bless you. So you're 96?" The old lady looked around the viewing room. at the velvet curtains, the polished wood, the heavy bronze handles, and the quiet comfort of the funeral home, then turned back to him. "Hardly worth going home, is it?" she remarked. Butch, the undertaker, opened his mouth to offer a comforting pastoral phrase, but the sheer, hilarious logic of her statement left his vocabulary paralyzed. He just stood there, blinking, holding his clipboard, while a couple of the deacons, standing near the door, had to quickly turn around and pretend they were having a coughing fit into their handkerchiefs. When you've lived for nearly a century in a place like Piney Grove, you don't fear the cemetery next door. You view it with the practical familiarity of an old neighbor. We went ahead with the service, and I preached her husband home with all the dignity he deserved. But every time I looked down at the front row, I had to admire the grit of a woman who could look at the final horizon and find the punchline. The possum hunt protocol. If you spend enough time around the outer edges of Piney Grove, down where the county dirt roads turn to logging trails and the pine trees grow thick enough to blot out the sun, you run into a specific breed of country logic. It's a way of thinking that is fiercely practical, deeply literal, and occasionally downright terrifying. I'll never forget the time Cleatus and Billy Bob, two of the county's most dedicated, if somewhat intellectually unburdened foresters, decided to head out past the old mill road for a late-night possum hunt. They had their flashlights, their hounds, and a singular focus. But halfway through a thicket, the night took a drastic turn, a sudden crisis. Without warning, Billy Bob let out a strange, wet grunt, stiffened up like a pine plank, and keeled straight over into the briars. He didn't move. He wasn't breathing. His cap knocked clean off his head, and his eyes were rolled back so far you could only see the whites. Cleatus immediately bypassed the standard stages of grief and went straight into a high-octane blue and orange panic. Drop-kicking his flashlight into the brush, he whipped out his cell phone with shaking fingers and dialed 911. The dispatch operator over at the county seat was having a quiet evening until Cleatus's voice shattered her headset. "Oh my God, help, drop everything!" he frantically blurted out, pacing a tight circle around his motionless partner. "My bud Billy Bob just died. He just keeled right over in the dirt. He's dead, I tell you. I'm out here by myself. What can I do?" The professional response. Now, 911 operators are trained to be the calm center of the storm. They possess a rhythmic, soothing cadence designed to slow down a racing heart. "Take it easy, sir," the operator said, her voice dropping into a comforting maternal register. "Take a deep breath. I can help you through this. Just listen to me carefully and follow my instructions exactly, okay? First, before we do anything else, let's make sure he's dead." The operator paused, expecting Cleatus to check for a pulse, feel for breath on his hand, or maybe lean down to listen to Billy Bob's chest. Instead, there was a heavy, pregnant silence on the line, save for the sound of dry pine needles crunching under boots. Then, out of nowhere, a deafening boom echoed through the receiver, the unmistakable, window-rattling blast of a 12-gauge shotgun tearing through the country night. The follow-up. The operator jumped 6 inches out of her chair, her headset nearly flying off. Before she could even find her breath to ask what on earth had just happened, the sound of boots crunched back toward the phone. Cleatus lifted the receiver back to his ear, breathing heavily, but sounding remarkably more composed now that the first step of the checklist was thoroughly checked off. "All right," Cleatus said, clearing his throat. "Okay, now what?" "I've always said that leadership requires clarity, but in the backwoods of Alabama, you have to be incredibly specific with your vocabulary. Otherwise, a simple verification process can become the final layout before the ambulance even clears the station house. Now call the Piney Grove Funeral Home, Miss Pearl's renewal of the Piney Grove Gazette, the Great Gazette Renewal." Pearl's humorous interview with Butch Hampton in the quaint town of Piney Grove, nestled near the rolling hills of North Alabama. Pearl Beasley was known as the feisty editor of the Piney Grove Gazette. With her oversized glasses perched precariously on her nose and a notepad that seemed bigger than her heart, she was ready for a transformation, both for herself and for the Gazette, which had started to show signs of age, much like Pearl herself. One fine Thursday morning, while sipping her usual cup of strong coffee, which she affectionately called the wake-up juice, Pearl hatched a brilliant plan. "I'll conduct a series of interviews with prominent community leaders. That'll give the Gazette the shot in the arm it needs." She plopped the coffee cup down with a determined clink, startling the cats or whiskers who promptly abandoned their perch. With excitement bubbling, Pearl grabbed her notepad and wrote down a list of potential interviewees. First on the list was none other than Butch Hampton, the owner of the local funeral home. There's no better place to start a renewal than with someone who knows all about life's transitions, she declared, unfazed by the subject matter. The very next day, Pearl strode into Butch's funeral home, a place known for its warm touches and not so warm realities. Butch was arranging flowers, looking as dapper as a man whose profession called for a perpetual somberness. As Pearl approached, the corner of his mouth twitched, unsure whether to smile or prepare for the serious topic at hand. Pearl, Butch greeted, wiping his hands on his bow tie. What brings you to my side of the afterlife? I'm here to interview you for the Gazette, Butch. It's time we explore the rich history and significance of funeral directing in our beloved Piney Grove, she announced, readying her oversized notepad. Funeral directing? That's quite the topic, he chuckled. You could say it's my grave responsibility. Oh, Butch, save the puns for the obituary section. Let's get to the hard-hitting questions. First up, how did you end up in the funeral business? Butch leaned back, a subtle twinkle in his eye. Well, my family has a long history in this business. My grandfather was a mortician, my father was a mortician, and I guess you could say it runs in my veins, if not in my arteries. Pearl scribbled down his responses, struggling to keep her laughter at bay. And what events have shaped the funeral industry here in Piney Grove? Many events, Butch said, crossing his arms. Like the grand opening of my funeral home, my mother was so proud. She said, Butch, now you can finally take a load off. Literally, Pearl let out a hearty laugh. I can see where you get your sense of humor. But really, what makes funeral directing integral to the community here? Butch's tone shifted slightly. A more serious note is woven in. You know, Pearl, in a small town like Piney Grove, we are all interconnected. Funerals allow us to celebrate lives, share stories, and ultimately support one another during tough times. It's a chance for the community to come together. Pearl nodded, genuinely touched by his sincerity. That's beautiful, Butch. But tell me, what's the wildest request you've ever received? Butch rubbed his chin, his eyes glinting with mischief. Oh, there have been a few. There was the time a man requested to be buried on a motorcycle because he wanted to ride off into the sunset, even in death. And then there was Mrs. Malone, who insisted on a disco-themed funeral, complete with a glitter ball and her favorite Bee Gees songs. Let's say it was one of the livelier services I've coordinated. Pearl snorted, nearly spilling her coffee. I can imagine. Sounds like a party I would not want to miss. Pearl, it's not always somber here, Butch assured her with a grin. We make room for laughter, along with the tears. After all, laughter is the best medicine, except when it's at a funeral. Then it's an awkward silence. Your positivity is infectious, Butch, she said, scribbling away. What advice would you give someone looking to enter the funeral profession? Don't take life too seriously. If you can't laugh about it, why bother? Plus, pick a catchy slogan. I've always thought gone, but not forgetting has a nice ring to it. With the interview winding down, Pearl decided to take one last shot. And what about your own funeral, Butch? Have you planned it yet? Butch laughed heartily. Oh, Pearl, I don't worry about that. I've already told my family to throw a party. Best to celebrate my life than mourn over it. Hopefully, with half the community dancing. Next question, Butch. What is one of your most unusual requests? Here is one of my favorites. On a Saturday morning, Ethel, a lifelong friend, stopped by the home. Ethel was the heart and soul of Kmart, where she worked as a greeter. Ethel had been with Kmart for more years than she could count, and her warm smile was as constant as the special blue light that flickered over the discount aisle. To her, that blue light wasn't just a sign of a sale, it was an invitation to make someone's day a little brighter. At 92, Ethel had a twinkle in her eye and a spring in her step, surprising anyone who dared to guess her age. With gray hair pulled back in a bun and a collection of vibrant cardigans that seemed to grow brighter with each passing year, she radiated joy. Ethel had a knack for remembering everyone's name and their favorite purchases. She even knew that old Mr. Thompson preferred the brand of beans that came with a blue label. One sunny afternoon after her shift, Ethel decided it was time to make arrangements for her own funeral. You know, she mused to herself, it's best to have everything sorted out. After all, I don't want to leave a mess for my dear ones. So, she made her way to Butch Hampton's funeral home, a place known for its quaint charm and Butch's warm smile, a man with a heart just as big as Ethel's. Upon arriving, Ethel was greeted by Butch, who was deeply engrossed in a surprisingly vibrant conversation about floral arrangements. Uh, Ethel, what brings you in today? He asked, putting down a glossy brochure featuring a stunning array of caskets. Ethel smiled sweetly and said, Butch, dear, I'd like to pre-arrange my funeral. You know, just in case I get carried away by a bit of joy or something while trying on those new orthopedic shoes. Butch chuckled, amused by her practicality and her unwavering zest for life. They went through the available options. Everything from classic pine boxes to glamorous velvet-lined caskets that looked like something straight out of a Hollywood film. Now I know all this is good and fun, Butch, but let's make sure we keep it simple, Ethel said. What can we do to keep the costs down? Maybe I could settle for a cardboard box. Butch offered a kind smile. Well, I wouldn't recommend that, Ethel. Cardboard doesn't hold up very well. How about we go with something that balances quality and affordability? After a brief negotiation over flowers and music, she requested Dancing Queen, much too. Whenever I kicked the bucket, Ethel had finally arranged everything. She felt accomplished, as if she had just scored a lifelong supply of blue light specials. A few days later, with her arrangement safely tucked away in a folder labeled Ethel's Final Fry, a nod to her quirky sense of humor, she decided to stop by the funeral home again. As she walked in, Butch was flipping through catalogs, reminiscing about his latest floral mishaps. Never trust a rose that's too red, he warned dramatically. Ethel, Butch exclaimed, back again. Yes, indeed, I was just wondering. Ethel began lowering her voice conspiratorially. Do you folks ever put any of your funerals on sale? You know, like a clearance section. Butch's jaw dropped, and for a moment he stared at her in disbelief. Ethel, I don't think we do. Ethel interrupted, her eyes twinkling with mischief. I mean, you've got the casket specials, but what about a buy one? Get one half off for your spouses. Can you throw in a discount for a friend? Maybe treat them to a just because funeral package. Butch burst into laughter, shaking his head. Ethel, you are the only person I know who can turn funeral planning into a lively shopping experience. If there were a blue light special on caskets, you'd be the first in line. Ethel grinned, the blue light in her eyes shining even brighter than the one at Kmart. Well, I can't take it with me, Butch. You know how much I love a deal. But I'll tell you what, Butch said, still chuckling. If I do ever decide to launch a buy one get one sale, I'll make sure you're the first to know. Deal? Deal? Ethel exclaimed, shaking his hand like a businesswoman sealing a lucrative contract. And don't forget my Dancing Queen playlist. As Ethel left the funeral home, she couldn't help but smile, knowing that she had just brought a touch of her signature and humor to a subject most deemed grim. Life was too short, not just for the living, but for the dead, to take anything too seriously. And so with the special blue light guiding her way, Ethel bound down the street, ready for whatever life, and perhaps even the inevitable, had to throw at her next, embracing each moment as if it were a delightful sale at her beloved Kmart. Miss Pearl, Butch, I don't know that you can top that story, but I'm going for it. What's your best innovation? Grief care, Butch said. That's easy. Hubcap, the grief dog extraordinaire, Butch Hampton was known for two things: his impeccable funeral service and his uncanny ability to make even the saddest of situations a little brighter. One day, a wild idea struck him to introduce a grief dog to his funeral home. Dogs help heal hearts, he mused. What better way to ease sorrow than with a furry friend? And thus began the quest for the perfect grief dog. Butch scoured the local animal shelters, eager to find a canine companion that radiated love and comfort. After an extensive search and a few comical encounters, like the time a particularly hyper puppy knocked over a display of caskets, he finally came across the winning pup. A scruffy little mutt with big brown eyes, Butch decided to name him Hubcap after his uncanny resemblance to an old hubcap covered in mud. And of course, because it was a name that would grab attention, Hubcap quickly became the unofficial mascot of the Piney Grove Funeral Home. Wherever Butch went, Hubcap was sure to follow, clad in a tiny bow tie that made him look dapper. Almost immediately, they were a hit in the community. People flocked to the funeral home, not just for the services, but to get some quality FaceTime with the grief dog. Come in for the caskets, stay for the canine. Butch joked at each event. Hubcap's role was to sit patiently by grieving family members, offering a comforting paw or a soft nuzzle, and somehow managing to lighten even the heaviest of hearts. At times, Butch would catch Hubcap watching over mourners like an old, wise sage, his floppy ears flicking with interest at all the hugs and tears. One day, a family came in for the service of their beloved grandmother. Hubcap took his responsibility seriously. As the family cried and shared memories, Hubcap zoomed around, wriggling his way into their hearts. At one point, he brought a specific grandchild his favorite squeaky toy, which contained the unmistakable scent of, well, everything. The room erupted in laughter, and suddenly the atmosphere lit up. "Thank you, Hubcap," the little boy exclaimed, hugging the goofy dog tight. In the months that followed, Hubcap's fame grew, and he even became somewhat of a local celebrity. He was featured in the Gazette, Pearl couldn't resist writing a heartwarming story about Hubcap, the dog that heals. People began scheduling appointments at the funeral home to meet the lovable mutt. One day, word spread that Hubcap would be attending the annual Piney Grove Fair. Butch and Hubcap set off, tails wagging and bow ties flopping. At the fair, Hubcap competed in the Best in Show contest. He strutted his stuff with the grace of a seasoned performer, trotting before a cheering crowd, leaping around kids who squealed with delight. Ultimately, he didn't win, but received an honorary title, most likely to brighten your day. Sadly, the good times didn't last forever. One fateful morning, Hubcap suddenly stopped chasing his favorite tennis ball. Butch recognized the signs. Hubcap, the indomitable grief dog, had grown old. A wave of sadness washed over him, but he knew that it was time to say goodbye. Hubcap passed away peacefully in his cozy spot near Butch's desk, surrounded by photos of the countless lives he had touched. When the news spread, the town of Piney Grove was heartbroken. The local Reverend Hollis offered his services, insisting that Hubcap deserved a fitting send-off. The day of Hubcap's public funeral arrived, and the turnout was overwhelming. People from all around Piney Grove and some from neighboring towns gathered at Butch's funeral home to celebrate the life of their furry friend. They brought treats, squeaky toys, and framed pictures of Hubcap engaging in his most cherished activities. The atmosphere was cheerful, a true reflection of Hubcap's spirit. Reverend Hollis stood by a beautifully adorned, pet-sized casket lined with comforting dog blankets. Today, we remember a pup who brought joy, laughter, and most importantly, healing to our community, he began. Hubcap was the kind of friend who would lend an ear to your troubles and never judge your choice of chew toy. The crowd laughed, wiping away tears as they shared stories of Hubcap's indisputable charm, like the time he dropped a slobbery bone into a grieving widow's lap, instantly turning her tears into giggles. As the service came to a close, Butch took a deep breath and shared, "Hubcap was more than just a dog. He was our heart, our comfort, and sometimes our comic relief. Let's remember him not with sadness, but with the joy he brought into our lives." After the formalities, the townsfolk gathered for Hubcap's final resting place, a sunny spot under a big oak tree, surrounded by flowers and heartfelt mementos. They each took turns throwing a tennis ball or a treat into a little dog-shaped box nearby, a token of love that would accompany him on his journey. With laughter echoing through the air and a beautiful spirit illuminating their hearts, the people of Piney Grove learned that Hubcap may have left the physical world, but the bond they shared was eternal. On that day, a once sad funeral home transformed into a whimsical celebration of life, love, and of course, a furry friend who would never be forgotten. And wherever you went in Piney Grove after that, you could hear whispers of joy. Have you heard? Hubcap's up there watching over us, still wagging his tail. Miss Pearl, so proud of herself for giving birth in such a heartwarming way for the renewal of the Piney Grove Gazette. One last question, Butch. What's another unusual happening? Butch leaned back in the chair and told the story. Butch said, "I can't quite remember the family's name, but during a span of 5 years in my early teens, they were a grim subject of conversation in our small community. It was as if tragedy had marked their lives like a dark cloud, for every death that struck this family was unsettlingly unexpected. There was no gradual decline due to illness or a heart attack. Instead, their tragedies were sudden and shocking. One brother, for example, met his end in a horrific accident when something heavy fell upon him, while another's life was cut short in a terrible car wreck. The first among the 5 brothers to die faced an especially grim fate while attempting to change a fuse in their home. He inadvertently stuck his thumb into the fuse box and was electrocuted. They all were in their early 20s or 30s, young men full of promise and potential, yet fate dealt them a cruel hand. It was clear they were not the most cautious or aware individuals, perhaps reflecting their sheltered upbringing as they all lived with their parents. The family dynamic was unique. 2 of the brothers eventually married, and when they did, the house was expanded to accommodate the new additions, with 2 extra rooms added. This communal living reinforced the bond among the brothers, despite the looming shadow of tragedy. The eldest brother held a job with the Atlanta West Point Railroad, working as a switchman, a role that required great responsibility and attention to detail, qualities that seemed to elude them in their personal lives. I vividly recall the day we embalmed the eldest brother is etched in my memory. I must have been around 11 or 12 years old at the time, and it was right around Christmas. An ironic backdrop to such a somber occasion, my father, who was a funeral director, shook me awake on a Friday or Saturday night and announced, "Come ride with me." He had received a call about the deceased brother, and it was not uncommon for him to take me along to observe the process. They called my daddy, telling him that Hampton, Sr., was out of the casket and they couldn't put him back in the casket. As we approached the house, I was struck by how cold it was inside. The home, located off Old West Point Road, still possessed remnants of an era long past. An old radiant heater struggled to produce warmth in the dimly lit living room, where every room seemed to have its own heater, a stark contrast to the bustling family that inhabited it. My eyes wandered around the room until they landed on something that piqued my interest, a Polaroid camera perched on a shelf. At that time, Polaroid cameras were new and fascinating. I had seen them advertised, but had never actually seen one in use. I gazed at the collection of Polaroid pictures hanging on the walls. Each snapshot is a fleeting memory captured in time, but the significance of those images struck me only later. It was at that moment, as I turned my head to look back toward my father standing near the casket, that I realized the terrible truth. The boy wasn't in the casket at all. In a bizarre and unsettling twist of fate, the family had pulled him out of the casket to stand beside his brothers for one last photograph. They gathered around him, a solemn semblance of togetherness despite the horror of their situation. The four brothers stood in casual attire while the deceased were dressed in a suit, embodying the finality of their fate. It was a strange, surreal scene, one that left me feeling both out of place and acutely aware of life's fragility. As the camera clicked and captured that haunting moment, I felt a wave of sorrow wash over me, recognizing that my father and I were likely the only ones in South Fulton County who did not join in for that final photograph with him. Each click of the Polaroid was both a celebration of life and an acknowledgement of the darkness that had befallen this family, a family that so vividly illustrated the unpredictability of existence. As Pearl left the funeral home, she couldn't help but think she had started her series of interviews on the right foot, or perhaps more accurately, the right footstone. Armed with stories of humor, life, and community connection, she felt reinvigorated to give the Piney Grove Gazette the revival it truly deserved. Pearl stood up, shaking with laughter. "Well, Butch, thanks for being such a good sport. You've undoubtedly brightened my day and given me plenty to share with our readers." Butch, watching her leave, shouted after her, "And don't forget to tell them I have some great discounts for pre-planned funerals. Only if you promise not to send me a bill for any of this," Pearl called back, grinning. And with that, she marched toward a bright future for both her paper and their small town, carrying Butch's witty insights and contagious laughter with her, ready to share them with everyone who still believed in the joyful spirit of small town life. Miss Pearl was proud of her idea for the Piney Grove Gazette and of her first interview with Butch Hampton. She can't wait to post the interview with Reverend Hollis. The headline reads, "Reverend Hollis reveals secrets of the Piney Grove ministry." Very well. I'm going to know what. The Yuletide graveside incongruity. If you happen to find yourself down at Jack's on a morning when the humidity is thick enough to skim with a ladle, you'll usually find Butch Hampton sitting in the center booth. As the county funeral director, Butch has spent decades navigating the delicate, unpredictable waters of human grief and final logistics. He's seen it all, from family feuds over a silver-plated punch bowl to folks trying to bury their uncle in his favorite lounge chair. Just the other day, Larry was talking about how easily signals get crossed when folks are flustered, which made Butch set his fork down, wipe his brow with a handkerchief, and recount the most musically agonizing graveside service he ever had to engineer at the Piney Grove Cemetery. The final instruction. "Now, planning a final send-off is a serious business," Butch began, his voice carrying that low, resonant rumble that instantly quiets a room. "And I make it a point of professional pride to honor a person's last wishes, no matter how eccentric they might seem on paper. A few years back, old Miss Elva passed away. She was a sweet, devout soul who had lived out on the ridge for 92 years. Her well-meaning but easily confused nephew, Billy, came into my office to finalize the arrangements. He was sweating through his collar, clutching a piece of scrap paper where he'd jotted down his aunt's final instructions. He looked at me real solemn-like and said, "Mr. Hampton, Aunt Elva was very specific about the music. She told me right before she closed her eyes that she wanted everyone gathered around the tent to sing Jingle Bells. She said it was the only song that truly captured the joy of where she was heading, the mid-August sleigh ride." Well, Butch chuckled, shaking his head at the memory, It was the middle of a scorching 95-degree August afternoon. The asphalt on the cemetery bypass was literally bubbling in the heat, and the gnats were out in full force. But as I said, I don't argue with a mandate from the departed. We got out to the graveside, the family took their seats under the green canvas tent, and the preacher finished up his remarks. The time came for the requested congregational hymn. I stepped up to the front, cleared my throat, and announced to the somber, black-dressed crowd that, per Miss Elva's explicit written request, we were going to lift our voices together in song. I gave the nod to the church pianist, who had brought out a little battery-powered keyboard for the occasion. She looked at me like I'd lost my mind, but she struck a chord. We started in, real slow and mournful, out of respect for the venue, dashing through the snow in a one-horse open sleigh, or the fields we go, laughing all the way. Friends, I am telling you, it was the most painful piece of acoustic architecture this county has ever produced. You haven't experienced true spiritual tension until you've heard 30 grieving relatives try to sing about a winter wonderland while wiping sweat from their necks in a dusty, red clay cemetery. The musical correction. We made it exactly halfway through the first chorus, Butch said, laughing as he leaned over the laminate table, while the fry cook stopped his spatula mid-scrape to listen. We were right on the "oh, what fun it is to ride" part when Miss Elva's oldest sister, Miss Clara, who was 94 and sharp as a briar, suddenly stood up from her folding chair. She smacked her cane down against the grass, glared at her nephew Billy, and shouted clear over the singing, "Stop it! Stop this ridiculous foolishness right this instant." The keyboard went dead silent. The whole crowd froze. Miss Clara marched right up to the casket, turned on Billy, and shook her finger. "Billy, you absolute simpleton," she hollered. "Your Aunt Elva didn't ask for a Christmas carol about a bobsled. She spent 70 years singing in the choir. She told you she wanted 'When I Heard Those Golden Bells.' She was talking about the glory land, not a snowdrift, the true harmony of the ridge." "Well, sir," Butch smiled, a warm look coming into his eyes as he looked around at the regulars at the counter. Poor Billy turned redder than a sliced tomato. He looked at his notes and realized he'd written down the first thing his panicked brain associated with the word bells. But you know what the beautiful thing about Piney Grove is? We didn't need a hymnal to fix the ledger. The keyboard player didn't even need to find a new key. She just shifted her fingers on those plastic keys, and before the dust could even settle from the argument, Pastor Cohn lifted his voice and started leading us in that beautiful old-time sanctuary standard. There's a land beyond the river that we call the Sweet Exchange, and I long to hear the story of the soul's eternal home when I hear those golden bells ringing out for you and me. By the second verse, every single soul under that hot canvas tent was singing in perfect four-part country harmony. The tension just melted away into the pines, and it turned out to be one of the sweetest send-offs we ever had. She, being dead, yet speaketh, the woman in the magnolia room. Clover May Pickett died on a Tuesday, which Eunice Pritchard always said was the most honest day of the week. Monday fooled you into thinking the week might be different this time. Wednesday pretended to be the middle of something important, but Tuesday just showed up, gray and unannounced, and got on with it. No pretense, no apology. Clover May would have appreciated that. Eunice had known her for 61 years, not well, the way you know a sister or a best friend, but the way you know someone in a town like Piney Grove, which is to say completely and selectively at the same time. She knew Clover May took her coffee black and her gossip with a grain of salt. She knew she had outlived a husband, a son, and whatever hope she once carried behind those careful gray eyes. She knew she grew the best tomatoes on Sycamore Street and that she hadn't set foot inside Pine Grove Church in over 30 years, which in this town was the kind of thing people still talked about as if it had happened recently. What Eunice did not know, what nobody in Piney Grove knew or thought they knew or admitted to knowing, was why. The call came at 6:47 in the morning. Eunice was on her second cup of coffee, still in her housecoat, when Butch Hampton phoned from the funeral home. He always called her first. His father had called her first too, and his grandfather before that, which meant Eunice had been the first to know about most of the deaths in Piney Grove since 1973. She kept that information folded quietly inside herself, the way some women kept recipes, carefully and with a sense of responsibility about who deserved them. "Miss Eunice," Cal said. He was 34 years old and still called her Miss Eunice, which she respected. "Mrs. Pickett passed sometime in the night. Neighbor found her this morning when her porch light was still on." "Was it peaceful?" Doc Bennett thinks so. She was in her chair, Bible in her lap. He paused. There's no family we can locate. I thought you might know something. Eunice set down her coffee cup. There's a nephew, she said. Hold something. Lives up near Tuscaloosa. She mentioned him once, maybe 10 years ago, and the way she said it told me everything I needed to know about him. Which was? That she didn't say his name twice. Cal was quiet for a moment. He was a thoughtful young man, which was both his greatest asset and his occasional inconvenience in a town that sometimes preferred its funeral directors to be efficient rather than contemplative. I'll start making calls, he said. Can you come in? Give me 20 minutes, Eunice said. And Butch, don't let anybody in that house until I get there. The house? The funeral home. Don't let anybody wander. Not yet. She hung up before he could ask her what she meant by not yet, because she wasn't entirely sure herself. It was just a feeling she had, low and quiet, like the feeling before the weather. The Piney Grove Funeral Home sat at the corner of Elm and Route 7, a white clapboard building with green shutters and a sign out front that had read Dupree and Sons for 3 generations. However, Butch's brother Raymond had moved to Atlanta 15 years ago and had no intention of returning to either Piney Grove or the family business. The magnolia tree in the front yard was older than the building, older than most of the town's memories, and in the spring it bloomed so heavily that the smell reached all the way to the courthouse steps. It was October now, and the tree was just bones against a white sky. Eunice parked in the back, the way she always did, and let herself in through the side door with a key she'd carried so long the teeth were worn smooth. The hallway smelled the way it always smelled: lilies, furniture polish, and something underneath both of those things that wasn't unpleasant exactly, just permanent, like the building itself had absorbed 50 years of grief and learned to hold it quietly. Butch was in the preparation room. He looked up when she came in, and she noticed he had that expression he sometimes got, careful, uncertain, the expression of a man standing at the edge of something he couldn't quite name. She's in the magnolia room, he said. I wanted to wait for you. Eunice nodded, set her pocketbook on the side table, and smoothed the front of her blouse the way she always did before entering a room with the newly departed. It was not superstition, it was respect. Clover May Pickett lay on the preparation table, looking smaller than Eunice remembered her, the way the dead always looked smaller, as if whatever had been animating them had taken up more space than the body itself. Her white hair was still pinned, one hand resting at her side. The Bible was there. Butch must have brought it from the house. And beside it, tucked against Clover May's other arm, as if she'd been holding it, was a book Eunice didn't immediately recognize. Not a Bible. Smaller. Dark green cover, edges worn soft with age. Eunice stood very still. That came with her, Butch said from the doorway. The neighbor said she found her just like that, both books in her lap. Eunice walked to the table slowly. She looked at Clover May's face for a long moment, at the lines of it, the closed eyes, the particular piece that the dead sometimes wore, which always struck Eunice as either a mercy or a performance, depending on the life they'd led. Then she looked at the green book. She did not touch it, not yet. Go make coffee, Butch, she said quietly. Miss Eunice, the good kind, not that pod machine, the real pot. She didn't look at him. Please. He left. She listened to his footsteps as he went down the hall. Then she picked up the green book. The cover had no title. The edges of the pages had gone the color of old tea. She opened it to the first page, and there, in handwriting so small and careful, it looked like it had been written by someone afraid of taking up too much space, were these words: If you are reading this, then I am finally done carrying it. God forgive me, and God forgive them too, though they never asked for it. CMP, September 14th, 1974. Eunice stood in the magnolia room for a long time without moving. Outside, a car turned onto Route 7 and passed without slowing. Somewhere in the building, the old furnace ticked to life. The magnolia tree stood bare against the October sky, patient as it had always been, keeping its own counsel. Eunice closed the diary. She held it in both hands and looked at Clover May's face one more time. All right then, she said softly. All right. She put the diary in her pocketbook, and she went to have her coffee. Long distance. Eunice got home at noon, made herself a sandwich she didn't eat, and sat at her kitchen table with the diary in front of her and her hands folded on top of it like she was praying, which she supposed she was. She had not opened it again. She wasn't ready, or rather, she was waiting until she understood why she'd taken it, which she wasn't entirely proud of. Eunice Pritchard had worked in that funeral home for 51 years without once removing so much as a hairpin from a deceased person's effects. She was not a thief. She was not a gossip, despite what Miss Lula Mae Jenkins would tell you, because there was a fundamental difference between knowing things and spreading them, and Eunice had always lived on the responsible side of that line. But something about that diary had slipped through her hands and into her pocketbook before her better judgment had been properly consulted. And now, here she sat, a 73-year-old woman, with a secret that wasn't hers, and a sandwich going stale at her elbow. The phone rang at 2:15. She looked at it for 2 full rings before she answered. Pritchard residence. Yes, ma'am. The voice was male, middle-aged, with the particular smoothness of a man who used it professionally. I'm trying to reach the Piney Grove Funeral Home. I may have dialed wrong. You did, Eunice said, but I work there. Can I help you? A small pause, just small enough that most people wouldn't have caught it. Eunice caught it. This is Holt Pickett. Clover May Pickett was my aunt. I got a message this morning from a Mr. Dupree saying she'd passed. Yes, Eunice said. I'm very sorry for your loss, Mr. Pickett. Thank you, ma'am. He said it the way people say, you're welcome, when they don't mean it either. I'll be driving down on Thursday. I just wanted to make sure everything is in order before I get there. Everything is being handled with great care, Eunice said. Butch Hampton is as fine a funeral director as his father was. I'm sure he is. Another pause, this one slightly longer, slightly more deliberate. Aunt Clover May was a private woman. I want to make sure her personal effects are kept private until the family can go through them properly. Eunice looked at the diary on her kitchen table. Of course, she said. She had some books, some personal writings possibly, things like that. There it was. Eunice had been waiting for it the way you wait for the second shoe. Once you've heard the first one hit the floor. She kept her voice exactly as it had been. Measured, warm, professionally sympathetic. Mr. Pickett, she said, your aunt passed in her home. Her personal belongings are a matter for the family and the county, in whatever order the law requires. I'm sure Sheriff Harper can help you understand the process when you arrive. The silence this time was different, cooler. I wasn't suggesting anything improper, he said. I know you weren't, Eunice said pleasantly. Is there anything else I can help you with today? He thanked her in that same hollow way and hung up. Eunice set the receiver down and sat for a moment, looking at the window above her kitchen sink, at the oak tree in her backyard, losing its leaves in the October wind, one at a time, unhurried. Then she picked up the diary and opened it to the first entry. March 3rd, 1974. I have decided to write this down because I am afraid of what happens to truth when it lives only inside a person. People die. Truth dies with them. And some truths are too heavy to bury. I will not use full names. I am not so far gone as that. But I will write what happened in the order it happened, and I will keep this where I keep everything that matters, inside the Word of God, where the wrong kind of people never think to look. It began, as most of the sorrows in this town begin, with a family that had more pride than sense and more money than either. The child was born on a February night. The mother was not married. The father would not say he was the father because saying so would have cost him something. And that family had never, in its history, paid a price they could arrange for someone else to pay instead. The baby was a girl. She was given away before she was given a name. I know this because I was there. I was 23 years old, and I have not had a peaceful night's sleep since, which I accept as the interest on a debt I should never have agreed to carry. His initial was E. Hers was M. The babies, I will not write. Not yet. Maybe not ever. God help us all. CMP. Eunice read the entry twice, then she set the diary down very carefully, the way you set down something that might break or might break you, and she pressed both hands flat on the table and breathed. E. She knew every family in Piney Grove going back 4 generations. She had filed their paperwork, received their flowers, answered their phone calls, and stood at the edge of their gravesides. She had watched their children grow up, their parents diminish, and their secrets surface the way things always did in small towns, slowly and without mercy. There were not many families in Piney Grove with money enough to make a problem disappear in 1974. There were fewer still whose name began with E. Eunice stood up from the kitchen table, went to the cabinet above the refrigerator, and took down the bottle of bourbon she kept there for emergencies and the occasional hard Tuesday. She poured 2 fingers into a juice glass, looked at it, and poured a third. She thought about Holt Pickett's voice on the phone, the smoothness of it, the way he'd said personal writings, as if the words were familiar in his mouth, as if he'd been rehearsing them. He knew. Whatever was in that diary, Holt Pickett already knew, or knew enough to be afraid of what a stranger might find. And he was coming on Thursday, which gave Eunice exactly 48 hours to decide what she was going to do about it. She was not a woman who made decisions quickly. She was a woman who made them correctly, which sometimes looked the same and sometimes didn't. She picked up the phone again. Dialed a number she knew by heart. It rang 3 times before a man's voice answered, low and unhurried, the voice of someone who had learned long ago that very little in this world required rushing. Reverend Cohn, she said, it's Eunice Pritchard. I need to come see you. A beat of silence. I'll put the coffee on, he said. He did not ask why. That was the thing about Thaddeus Cohn. He never asked why. He made room, the way a good pastor did, the way a good man did, which were not always the same thing, but in his case had always mercifully been. Eunice looked at the diary one more time before she put it in her pocketbook. The baby was a girl. She closed the clasp. Outside, the oak tree kept losing its leaves, patient and indifferent, the way October always was, what the pastor knew. Thomas Cohn had been the pastor at Piney Grove Church for 19 years, which made him a relative newcomer by the church's standards, since old Reverend Tillman had held the pulpit for 41 years before him and was still spoken of in the present tense by half the congregation. But 19 years was long enough to have buried most of the town at least once, married their children, and heard enough confessions, formal and otherwise, to have developed what Eunice privately considered the most valuable skill a pastor could possess, the ability to know things and say nothing for years if necessary, until saying something finally became an act of mercy rather than betrayal. His house sat behind the church, a modest brick place with a porch that caught the afternoon light, and when Eunice pulled into the gravel drive, he was already standing in the doorway, 2 mugs of coffee in his hands as he'd timed it. You look like a woman carrying something heavy, he said, handing her a mug as she came up the steps. I am. Want to sit? Or just want to say it standing up? Sitting, Eunice said. This isn't a standing up kind of conversation. They settled into the porch chairs, the old wicker ones that had been there as long as Eunice could remember, and for a moment neither of them said anything. Out past the church, the cemetery stretched toward the tree line, headstones leaning at the comfortable angles of long settlement, and Eunice thought, as she often did in this town, how strange it was that the dead and the living lived so close together and mostly managed not to think about it. Clover May Pickett, she said finally. Boone's face did something small. No surprise, recognition. I heard this morning, he said. I was sorry to hear it. She was a complicated woman. She left something behind. People generally do. A diary, Thaddeus. Eunice used his first name only when the conversation had moved past pleasantries into something that required honesty between equals. Going back to 1974, there's a baby in it. A girl, given away before she had a name. A father who wouldn't claim her, from a family with money enough to make the whole thing disappear. She watched him carefully as she said it. He didn't flinch. He didn't ask a single clarifying question. He looked out toward the cemetery for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice had gone quieter, the way a man's voice goes quiet when he's about to set down something he's carried a long way. Initial E, he said. It wasn't a question. Eunice's coffee mug stopped halfway to her mouth. You knew. I knew part of it. Cohn set his own mug down on the porch rail. Not from Clover May, from someone else a long time ago, in a confession I've kept for longer than I've kept almost anything else in my ministry. He rubbed a hand over his jaw. I was 26 years old, fresh out of seminary, filling in for Reverend Tillman while he recovered from his hip. A woman came to me, not Clover May, and told me something in confidence that I have never repeated to a living soul in 35 years. Thaddeus, I'm not going to repeat it now either, he said gently, but there was iron under the gentleness, not the way you mean. What's confessed to a pastor stays with the pastor, Eunice, even when the person confessing has long since passed. That's not a rule I get to set aside because it's become inconvenient or because curiosity is eating at good people in this town. This isn't curiosity, Eunice said, sharper than she intended. Clover May carried this for 50 years and died with two books in her lap like she was trying to balance them against each other. Holt Pickett is driving down from Tuscaloosa, asking about her personal writings before he's even seen her in the ground. Somebody out there is a grown woman right now who doesn't know where she came from, and the people who know are dying one by one and taking their pieces of it with them. Boone was quiet. What I can tell you, he said slowly, without breaking what was given to me in confidence, is this. What you have in that diary is true. I won't tell you it's exaggerated, and I won't tell you Clover May was confused or bitter or settling some old score because she wasn't. She was carrying something that wasn't entirely hers to carry, and she carried it anyway because the people who should have carried it wouldn't. The father, initial E. I won't confirm a name, Eunice. His eyes met hers, steady. Not because I don't trust you, because some doors, once you open them, you can't control which rooms people walk into next. And there's a woman, there may be a woman, out there who has built an entire life not knowing this, and that life deserves to be hers to open or not open. Not mine, not yours, not even Clover May's anymore. God rest her. Eunice sat back in the wicker chair. The afternoon light had shifted lower, gold now instead of white, slanting long across the grass cemetery. What am I supposed to do with it then? She asked, and for the first time her voice carried something close to weariness. I've got a green diary in my pocketbook that isn't mine, a nephew circling like a buzzard who already knows more than he's saying, and a pastor who's just confirmed there's a whole second half to this story he won't tell me. Cone leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and looked at her with the particular kindness he reserved for moments when kindness was the only honest thing left to offer. I think, he said, you do what you've always done in that funeral home for 51 years. You hold what's been placed in your hands with more care than the person who handed it to you. You don't run from it and you don't run with it. You sit with it until you understand what it's asking of you. And if it's asking me to find her, the daughter, then you'll know that when the time comes. He picked his coffee back up, and something in his posture eased, like a man setting down one weight even as he acknowledged another remained. But Eunice, if Holt Pickett already knows what's in that diary, you need to ask yourself why a man who never visited his aunt in life is suddenly so concerned with her papers and death. Eunice looked at him for a long moment. You think he's not protecting her memory, she said. You think he's protecting somebody's money. I think, one said carefully, that some families have spent 50 years building a silence, and silences that expensive don't stay quiet by accident. The wind moved through the cemetery, stirring the tops of the old oaks, and somewhere beyond the tree line a dog barked twice and went still. Eunice finished her coffee. I need you to do one thing, she said. If I can, if this comes apart, and Thomas, I think it's going to come apart, I need to know you'll stand in the middle of it with the people who get hurt, whoever they turn out to be, whichever side of this they're standing on. Boone held her gaze. That, he said quietly, I can promise you without breaking a single confidence. Eunice nodded, set her mug down, and stood. The porch boards creaked familiarly under her feet, the same boards she'd stood on for 19 years' worth of pastoral visits, christenings discussed, funerals planned, griefs unloaded. Thursday, she said. Holt Pickett gets here Thursday. Then you've got until Thursday, Boone said, to decide what kind of woman you're going to be about all this. She was almost to her car when he called after her. Eunice! She turned. Whatever's in that diary, he said. Clover May didn't leave it behind by accident. A woman doesn't write something down for 50 years and then die holding it in her lap without meaning for it to be found. She chose her moment. She chose you. Eunice stood very still in the gravel drive, the gold light slanting low now, almost amber, catching the dust her tires had kicked up. I know, she said softly. That's the part that scares me most. What Rosalie remembered. Rosalie Dubois lived on the far side of Piney Grove, past the railroad tracks that nobody called the railroad tracks anymore because the trains had stopped running through in 1989, in a small frame house with a garden so well tended it looked like someone had planted it with nothing but time and patience to spare, which Rosalie had never actually had in abundance. She'd raised 4 children, buried a husband, cleaned houses for half the white families in Piney Grove for the better part of 40 years, and was now 76 years old with hands that still moved like she had somewhere important to be. She was on her knees in the dirt, pulling weeds from around a row of collards when Eunice's car came up the gravel drive. "I wondered when you'd come," Rosalie said, without looking up. Eunice stopped halfway across the yard. "You knew I was coming?" "I knew somebody was coming." Rosalie sat back on her heels and looked up, shading her eyes with one dirt-streaked hand. "Clover May's been dead 2 days. A woman doesn't die holding a 50-year-old secret in her lap without somebody coming around asking questions eventually. I didn't know it'd be you." "Who'd you think it'd be?" "Didn't know. Hoped it'd be you, if I'm honest." Rosalie pushed herself up off her knees with the unhurried effort of a woman who'd long since stopped pretending her body was younger than it was. "Come on in. I'll wash up. You want tea or you want truth? Because I've only got time today for one of them, and the tea takes longer." They sat at Rosalie's kitchen table, a small, sturdy thing with a yellow oilcloth cover, gone soft and pale at the edges from decades of scrubbing. Rosalie didn't offer coffee or tea after all. She folded her hands on the table and looked at Eunice the way she might have looked at a child who'd finally asked the right question after years of asking the wrong ones. "I cleaned for Clover May 31 years," she said. "Started in 79, 5 years after whatever you're trying to piece together happened. By the time I came along, the worst of it was already buried. But grief doesn't stay buried clean, Eunice. It seeps. You clean a woman's house long enough, you learn the shape of what she's not saying." "Reverend Cohn wouldn't tell me a name," Eunice said. "Said it wasn't his to give?" "He's right, it isn't." Rosalie's voice carried no judgment, only fact. "But I confessed nothing to that man, so I don't carry the same kind of quiet he does." Eunice felt something in her chest go very still. "You knew her, the mother." "I knew who she became." Rosalie looked toward the window, where her garden sat green and ordered in the afternoon light. "Mara Lynn Tatum. You'd remember her as Mara Lynn Whitfield after she married. She passed away in 2003 from breast cancer at the county hospital. Quiet woman her whole life. Quiet in the way of somebody who'd learned a long time before that being quiet was safer than being seen." "Tatum." Eunice turned the name over. "I don't recall the family well." "You wouldn't. They weren't church people, weren't club people, weren't anybody this town paid attention to unless they needed something fixed or cleaned." A small, hard edge came into Rosalie's voice, the first Eunice had heard from her. "Mara Lynn was 17 years old in 1974, working as a hired girl up at the Ellard place, doing kitchen work and laundry, the way poor girls did back then for families with more rooms than they knew what to do with." Eunice's coffee-warmed hands went cold. The Ellard place. "Tell me you're not saying what I think you're saying," Eunice said quietly. "I'm saying exactly what you think I'm saying." Rosalie held her gaze, steady. "Edward Ellard, old Mr. Ellard's only son, 22 years old, home from college, full of himself, the way that family raised their boys to be. Mara Lynn was 17 and alone in a house with no mother to protect her and no money to make anybody listen if she'd dared to speak." "E," Eunice whispered. "Initial E." "Edward Ellard," Rosalie said again, like she'd been waiting 30 years to say the whole name out loud to somebody who'd believe her. "And before you ask, yes, that Ellard family. The one with the bank, and the cotton money before that, and the new wing on the hospital with their name carved over the door like God himself signed off on it." Eunice sat back in her chair, the kitchen suddenly feeling smaller than it had a moment before. "Judge Mercer," she said slowly. "Abigail Mercer was born Abigail Ellard," Rosalie finished. "Edward's younger sister, which means whatever's sitting in that diary of yours, Eunice, it doesn't just touch a dead man's reputation. It touches one of the most respected women in this county, sitting on the bench passing judgment on other people's sins 6 days a week." The kitchen was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and somewhere outside a mockingbird working through its repertoire in the collard patch. "What happened to the baby?" Eunice asked finally. "The diary says she was given away. Clover May wouldn't write the child's initial. Said maybe never." Rosalie's face changed then, softened and hardened at once, the particular expression of someone arriving at the part of the story that had cost her something to carry. Clover May's older sister lived 2 counties over in Calera, married, no children of her own, desperate for a baby, and not particular about how it came to her, not back then, not in a time when nobody asked too many questions if the right amount of money changed hands quietly enough. Rosalie's jaw tightened. The Ellards paid for the arrangement. Clover May drove Mara Lynn there herself the night the baby was born and brought back nothing but her own guilt to carry for the rest of her life. And Mara Lynn never saw the child again. Not once, not so much as a photograph. Rosalie's voice had gone rough at the edges now. She married Tatum's boy 2 years later, had 3 more children, lived right here in this town 30 more years, and never said one word about it to anybody but the Lord, and I expect Reverend Tillman before he passed, since he's the one who likely sent her to confession in the first place. Eunice pressed her fingers to her temples. So there's a woman out there right now, raised in Calera or wherever Clover May's sister ended up. She'd be, what, 52 years old now? 52 this past February, if the diary's dating it right. Does she know? I don't know what she knows, Rosalie said honestly. I know what happened on this end of it. What happened on hers, I couldn't tell you. Clover May's sister has been dead since the 90s. If that girl was ever told the truth, it didn't come from anybody I knew. Eunice sat with that for a long moment, the weight of it settling over the kitchen table like something with actual physical presence. Rosalie, she said finally, why are you telling me this? You've carried it for 30 years without telling anybody. Why now? Rosalie looked at her with an expression Eunice would remember for a long time afterward, tired and clear-eyed and entirely without bitterness, though she'd earned the right to plenty of it. Because Clover May spent 50 years letting that family's silence cost a girl named Marilyn everything and cost some other woman her whole history. And I held my peace right alongside her because that's what colored women in this town learned to do, hold our peace and clean up quietly after what white families broke. She said it without anger, which somehow made it land harder than anger would have. But Clover May's dead now, and I'm 76, and I find myself less and less interested in carrying other people's silence into my own grave. She reached across the table and, for the first time, laid her weathered hand over Eunice's. You find that girl, Eunice Pritchard, she said, whoever and wherever she is. She didn't ask to be the secret that this whole town built its quiet around. She deserves better than 50 more years of it. Eunice drove home slowly that evening, the autumn light long gone and copper across the fields, the Ellard name turning over and over in her mind like a stone she couldn't quite set down. Judge Abigail Mercer. Half the county appeared before that woman. She'd presided over Piney Grove's small sins and occasional large ones for over a decade, respected, feared, and, as the town liked to say, secretly compassionate. However, nobody had ever quite explained where that compassion came from. Now Eunice wondered if she knew. She wondered if Abigail Mercer had spent her whole life sitting 2 pews back from the truth about her own brother, never once looking directly at it. And she wondered, with a chill that had nothing to do with the October evening, what a woman like that, careful, powerful, accustomed to controlling rooms, might do if she learned a stranger's diary was about to drag her family's oldest sin into the light. The judge, Judge Abigail Mercer's chambers, sat on the second floor of the Piney Grove County Courthouse, behind a door with frosted glass and gold lettering that had been repainted so many times over the decades, it had the slightly raised, glossy look of a scar. Eunice had been in that building more times than she could count, filing death certificates, settling estates, standing witness to the small bureaucratic rituals that followed every funeral. But she had never once climbed these particular stairs with her heart beating the way it was beating now. She'd called ahead. That much courtesy she owed the woman, judge or not, family secret or not. Abigail's clerk, a young woman named Patsy, who'd grown up 2 streets over from Eunice, had said the judge could spare 15 minutes at 4 o'clock between a custody hearing and a dinner engagement. Eunice arrived at 3:55 and sat in the hard wooden chair outside chambers, the diary in her pocketbook resting against her hip like a held breath. At 4 o'clock exactly, Patsy opened the door. She'll see you now, Miss Eunice. Abigail Mercer was 61 years old and looked, as she always did, like a woman who had never once in her life been caught unprepared. She sat behind a wide mahogany desk, her robe already off, and hanging neatly behind the door, wearing a simple gray suit, her silver hair pulled back without a single strand out of place. She had her father's sharp eyes. Eunice had always thought that, without quite knowing, until 2 days ago, how true it ran. Eunice. Abigail gestured to the chair across from her desk. Patsy said this was about Clover May Pickett's arrangements. I didn't realize the courthouse handled funeral logistics these days. It's not about arrangements, Your Honor. Something in Abigail's face went very slightly still. Not alarm exactly, but the particular stillness of a woman accustomed to reading rooms for a living, recalibrating in real time. Then what is it about? Eunice had rehearsed this moment in her head a dozen times on the drive over, and every version had evaporated the second she sat down across from those sharp, watchful eyes. So she did the only thing she knew how to do, which was tell the truth plainly, the way she'd learned to deliver hard news to grieving families for 51 years, without flinching and without cruelty. Clover May died with a diary in her lap, Eunice said. It goes back to 1974. It talks about a baby girl born to a 17-year-old hired girl named Mara Lynn Tatum and given away before she had a name. She paused. The diary names the father only by an initial, E. I have reason to believe that initial stands for Edward Ellard. The courthouse was quiet enough that Eunice could hear the second hand moving on the clock above Abigail's bookshelf. Abigail Mercer did not move, did not blink. For one long moment, Eunice genuinely could not tell whether the woman across from her was about to call security or burst into tears, and the not knowing was almost worse than either possibility. My brother, Abigail said finally, very quietly, has been dead 11 years. I know. And you've come here to tell me that a dead woman's diary is about to drag him, and this family, through whatever this town's appetite for scandal can manage, 50 years after the fact, when the only people who could confirm or deny any of it are also dead. I've come here, Eunice said carefully, because there's a woman out there, 52 years old, who doesn't know where she came from unless somebody told her, and I don't believe anybody ever did. I didn't come here to ruin your brother's name, Your Honor. I came because I think you might already know something about this, and I needed to look you in the eye and find out. For a long moment, Abigail Mercer said nothing at all. She rose from her chair, walked to the window that looked out over the courthouse square, and stood there with her back to Eunice, her arms crossed over her chest in a posture Eunice recognized, the posture of a woman holding herself together by main force. I was 11 years old, Abigail said, to the window, not to Eunice, when my mother sent me to stay with our cousins in Selma for the entire summer of 1974. I didn't understand why at the time. I was 11. You don't ask questions like that at 11. You accept that the adults have decided something, and you go where you're told. She was quiet for a moment. I came home in September, and nobody ever spoke of it again. Not once. Not my mother, not my father, and certainly not Edward, who I do not believe ever spoke an honest word about himself in his entire life if a comfortable lie was available instead. You suspected something. I suspected everything and nothing, Eunice, which is what it is to grow up in a family built on the architecture of not asking. Abigail turned from the window. When Eunice saw them, her eyes were wet, though her voice had not wavered. There were whispers over the years, a girl from the kitchen staff who left suddenly, my mother's strange, sharp silence whenever Marlin Tatum's name came up at church years later, like she'd swallowed something bitter. I built a whole career out of the law, Eunice, out of evidence, out of facts, out of refusing to look away from uncomfortable truths in every courtroom I've ever sat in, and the one truth closest to my own family I never once let myself examine. Why not? Because examining it would have meant admitting what kind of people raised me, Abigail said, and for the first time her voice did break, just slightly, just at the edges. And because somewhere in me, I think I always knew, and knowing and proving are very different mercies to extend yourself. She sat back down slowly, the careful posture returning even as her face remained open in a way Eunice suspected very few people in Piney Grove had ever been permitted to witness. What do you intend to do with this diary? Abigail asked. I don't rightly know yet, Eunice admitted. Rosalie Dubois thinks I should find the daughter. Reverend Cohn thinks I should sit with it until I understand what it's asking of me. Holt Pickett, Clover May's nephew, already seems to know something, and he's arriving tomorrow, asking about her personal writings in a voice that didn't sound like grief to me. Something sharpened in Abigail's expression at that. Holt Pickett. You know him? I know of him. Abigail's mouth set in a thin line. He's done legal work, informally, never quite properly licensed, handling estate disputes for families who'd rather not involve a real attorney. If he's sniffing around Clover May's papers before she's even buried Eunice, I'd wager good money it's not her memory he's protecting. That's what Reverend Cohn said too. Then Reverend Cohn is a perceptive man. Abigail folded her hands on the desk, and when she spoke again, her voice had recovered its courtroom steadiness, though something underneath it remained changed. Eunice, I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer me honestly, the way you've answered everything else today. All right? If you find her, this woman, this niece of mine I have never met and never knew existed until 11 minutes ago, what do you imagine happens next? Do you imagine I sweep her into the family? Do you imagine the town forgives my brother 50 years too late or condemns him 50 years too late, neither of which does that woman 1 ounce of good? Her eyes were steady, searching. Or do you imagine, more honestly, that you simply hand a 52-year-old woman a grief that isn't currently hers to carry and call it justice because it made you feel like you'd done the right thing? Eunice sat with that question for a long moment because it deserved one. I don't know, she said finally. I think that's exactly the question I've been afraid to ask myself since Tuesday morning. Abigail nodded slowly, something like respect moving behind her eyes. Then we are, for once, she said, asking ourselves the same question. Eunice rose to leave a few minutes later, the 15 allotted minutes long since passed, Patsy hovering politely at the door. At the threshold, Abigail's voice stopped her. Eunice. She turned back. Whatever you decide, the judge said, I would ask one thing of you, not as a Mercer and not as Edward's sister, but as a judge who has spent 30 years trying to balance truth against mercy in rooms far less complicated than this one. She paused. Don't decide alone. Whatever this becomes, it's too large a thing for one woman's conscience to carry by herself, even a conscience as careful as yours. Eunice held her gaze. I think, she said quietly, that's the most honest thing anybody said to me all week. The search. Abigail Mercer called Eunice 2 days later, not from Chambers, but from her home phone, which Eunice noted, as it meant the judge had decided this conversation didn't belong in the courthouse at all. I've thought about it, Abigail said, without preamble. I'd like to help you find her, properly, carefully, and I'd like to do it before Holt Pickett does whatever it is he's planning to do, because I don't trust that man to handle this with anything resembling decency. What changed your mind? There was a pause on the line. I sat with my brother's photograph last night, longer than I have in years, Abigail said finally, and I realized I was angrier at him for the silence than for the sin. He had 50 years to make this right in some small way, and he chose comfort instead, every single time. I don't intend to make the same choice. They agreed to meet that evening at Eunice's kitchen table, neutral ground, away from Chambers and away from the funeral home, away from anywhere Holt Pickett might think to look. Abigail arrived at 7, out of her robes, in a plain cardigan that made her look, for the first time since Eunice had known her, like an ordinary tired woman rather than a judge. She set a leather folder on the kitchen table. I made some calls, she said, quietly, to people who owe me favors and know how to keep their mouths shut, which in this county is a shorter list than you'd hope. And? Clover May's sister was named Ruth Calhoun, married name. She and her husband lived in Calera until he died in 1991, after which Ruth moved to Birmingham to be near her church community. She passed in 1997. Abigail opened the folder. Calera's courthouse keeps adoption records sealed, as you'd expect, but informal arrangements, the kind made through family and a willing doctor rather than the state, don't always generate the same paper trail, which means we may not find a clean adoption record at all. Then how do we find her? We find the doctor. Abigail tapped the folder. Or the church. Ruth Calhoun was, by every account I could gather, a deeply religious woman who would have wanted whatever arrangement she made to be blessed by someone, even if made in secret. If a local minister or doctor was involved in 1974, there may be a baptismal record, even if there's no adoption decree. Eunice felt something in her chest loosen slightly, the particular relief of a vague, frightening task becoming a concrete, findable one. Where do we start? First Baptist of Calera, Abigail said. It's still standing. I called this afternoon and spoke to the current pastor. This young man was very accommodating once I explained I was researching family history for an elderly relative, which wasn't entirely a lie. He's agreed to let us look through the church's old baptismal registry this Saturday. You didn't tell him the truth. I told him a version of the truth, Abigail said evenly. I find in delicate matters the whole truth is rarely owed to strangers, even helpful ones. Saturday morning, they drove to Calera together in Abigail's car, an hour of mostly silent highway, broken occasionally by small, careful conversation about the weather, about Clover May's upcoming funeral, about nothing that mattered, which Eunice understood was its own kind of comfort between two women carrying something this heavy. First Baptist of Calera was a modest brick building with white columns, smaller than Piney Grove's church, but kept with the same fierce, loving attention small congregations gave their buildings. The young pastor, a Reverend Tilden, met them at the door and led them to a back office where a shelf of cracked leather registries stretched back to the 1940s. 1974 would be this one, he said, pulling a heavy book free and laying it open on the desk. I'll leave you to it. Just holler if you need anything. Eunice and Abigail sat shoulder to shoulder, turning the brittle pages slowly, scanning columns of careful, faded ink. Names, dates, parents, witnesses, February, March. The names blurred together, generations of Calera children blessed and recorded and mostly forgotten by anyone outside their own families. Then Abigail's finger stopped. April 21st, 1974, infant female. Parents, Ruth and Harold Calhoun. Witness, C.M. Pickett. Name given, Faith Eleanor Calhoun. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Faith, Eunice said softly. Clover May named her or stood by while somebody did. Faith Eleanor. Abigail's voice had gone thin. She would be Faith Eleanor something now. Married name, if she married. We can find that, Eunice said. If she's still in Alabama, if she's still alive, there's marriage records, property records, obituaries for the people who raised her. It's a real name now, Abigail. That's more than we had an hour ago. Abigail sat very still, looking down at the faded ink, at the small, ordinary entry that had sat undisturbed in a church basement for 52 years. Faith, she said again, quieter. He never even gave her a name, and somebody gave her that one anyway. I don't know whether that makes it better or very much worse. Maybe both, Eunice said. Most true things in this world are. They drove back to Piney Grove as the afternoon went gold and then gray, the radio off, the leather folder with its single photocopied page resting on the seat between them like something sacred and dangerous in equal measure. What happens now? Abigail asked, somewhere past the county line. Now we find out if Faith Eleanor wants to be found, Eunice said, and we go slow, and we go together, the way you said, not as a surprise sprung on her doorstep, and not as a story handed to a newspaper, and not as ammunition for whatever Holt Pickett thinks he's owed. And if she doesn't want any part of it, if we find her and she tells us to leave well enough alone? Eunice considered that for a long moment, watching the pines blur past the window, dark and patient the way they'd always been over this whole town, and everything it had ever tried to bury beneath them. Then we respect that, she said, and we carry the rest of this quietly, the way Clover May should have found the courage to do something about 50 years ago, instead of just writing it down and hoping somebody braver came along after her. Abigail almost smiled at that, small, tired, real. I think, she said, Clover May would have liked you handling this. I think, Eunice said, Clover May handed it to exactly the right pocketbook. Finding Faith. The trail from Faith Eleanor Calhoun to a living, breathing woman in the present day turned out to be slower and more tedious than either Eunice or Abigail had expected, which Eunice supposed was fitting, since nothing about this whole business had moved at the pace anyone wanted. They started with the obituaries. Ruth Calhoun's 1997 list of surviving family, a daughter, Faith Calhoun Whitlow of Montgomery, and Eunice felt the small jolt of recognition that came whenever a name on a page turned out to belong to an actual person still moving through the world. Whitlow, Abigail said, writing it down. She married a Whitlow. There are a few Whitlow families around Montgomery, Eunice said. Used to do business with a Whitlow funeral home down there, years back, before they closed. It was Patsy, Abigail's clerk, who found the rest, quietly, after hours, using the kind of public record searches Eunice wouldn't have known how to begin. Patsy was discreet by nature and had apparently developed a fierce, unspoken loyalty to whatever this was that her judge had gotten tangled in, because she handed over a single sheet of paper 3 days later without asking a single question. Eunice could see written on her face, Faith Eleanor Whitlow, age 52, address, Montgomery, Alabama, occupation, registered nurse, Baptist Medical Center South, married to Daniel Whitlow, 1994, 2 children, both grown. A nurse, Eunice said, reading it over Abigail's shoulder, spent her whole life around the sick and the dying, same as half this family she doesn't know she belongs to. Doc Bennett would say that's not a coincidence, Abigail said something to me once about certain kinds of grief running in families like eye color, even when nobody passes down the reason for it. They debated for the better part of a week how to approach her. Reverend Cohn, after careful consultation and without compromising his own confidence, advised against a letter she can set aside unread for months, turning it over with dread every time she sees it in a drawer. He said, "Whatever you decide, give her the dignity of a voice and a face, even if that voice trembles saying it." Rosalie advised the opposite. A woman ambushed on her doorstep by 2 strangers carrying 50 years of somebody else's guilt is a woman who slams the door, and she'd be right to, she said. Right first. Let her decide if she wants the rest. In the end, Eunice and Abigail split the difference, the way 2 careful women often did when neither felt entirely certain of their own judgment. Abigail drafted a short letter, measured, honest, naming no shame, asking nothing, offering only the truth and an open door, and Eunice insisted it include a telephone number rather than just an address, so that whatever Faith decided, she could decide it with a voice on the other end rather than silence. Dear Mrs. Whitlow, my name is Abigail Mercer. I am a circuit judge in Piney Grove, Alabama, and I am writing to you about a matter of family history that I believe concerns you directly. However, I understand this letter may come as a complete surprise, and I am sorry for that. A woman named Clover May Pickett passed away recently in Piney Grove. Among her belongings was a diary describing events from 1974, specifically the birth of a child who was given, through private arrangement, to a couple named Ruth and Harold Calhoun of Calera. Church records there show that the child was baptized Faith Eleanor Calhoun on April 21st, 1974. I believe, though I understand you are under no obligation to confirm or deny anything, that you may be that child. I am writing because I have reason to believe my own late brother, Edward Ellard, was your biological father. I do not write this to disrupt your life or to ask anything of you. I write only because I believe you deserve to know the truth, should you wish it, and to decide for yourself what, if anything, you would like to do with that knowledge. There is a woman here named Eunice Pritchard who has carried this matter with more care than I can adequately describe, and who would be glad to speak with you, by phone or in person, whenever and however you are ready. There is no urgency on our end except the urgency of not wanting you to learn anything you did not choose to learn. With respect, and with whatever comfort these words can offer, Abigail Mercer. The letter went out on a Thursday. Eunice did not sleep well for the 11 days that followed, though she told no one that, not even Reverend Cohn, who likely would have guessed it anyway. The phone rang on a Tuesday evening while Eunice was washing the dinner dishes, and something in the particular hour of it, the same hour, almost to the minute, that Holt Pickett had called weeks before, made her hands go still in the dishwasher before she'd even picked up the receiver. Pritchard residence! There was a long pause on the other end, a woman's breath, careful and uneven. My name is Faith Whitlow, the voice said finally, soft but steady, like someone who had rehearsed the sentence and was determined to get through it without breaking. I received a letter from Judge Mercer. I believe she said you might be willing to talk to me. Eunice set down the dish towel and sat down slowly at her kitchen table, the same table where this had all truly begun for her. Clover May's diary, Boone's coffee, Rosalie's garden dirt hands folded in confession. Yes, Eunice said gently, I am. Whenever you're ready, however you're ready, I'm right here. Another pause. Eunice could faintly hear a television playing somewhere in the background of Faith's house, the ordinary sound of an ordinary evening about to become something else entirely. I always knew I was adopted, Faith said quietly. My mother, Ruth, the woman who raised me, she never hid that from me, but she never told me anything else. Not where I came from, not who. I stopped asking when I was about 20 because every time I asked, something in her face looked like I was hurting her, and I loved her too much to keep doing that. She loved you very much, Eunice said. I never knew her, but everyone I've spoken to says the same thing. Is it true? Faith's voice cracked just slightly at the question. What the letter said about whose daughter I am. Eunice closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the full weight of 52 years settle into this one small kitchen, this one ordinary Tuesday. I believe it's true, she said. I have a diary written by the woman who arranged your adoption, naming the circumstances. I have a judge who's spent the last 2 weeks confronting her own family's silence to help find you. And I have a woman still living here in Piney Grove who knew your birth mother, Mara Lynn, and remembers her with more tenderness than this town ever showed her in life. Faith was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice had steadied, though something in it had also opened, like a door swinging slowly on a hinge that hadn't moved in decades. Tell me about her, Faith said. My mother, my other mother, Mara Lynn, and Eunice, sitting at her kitchen table with the evening darkening outside her window, began to tell her gently. The funeral? Clover, May Pickett's funeral, had been delayed 11 days, longer than any funeral in Piney Grove's recent memory, a fact that had not gone unnoticed at the diner, where speculation had grown wild enough that Miss Lula Mae Jenkins was reportedly taking bets on the reason, with theories ranging from a disputed will to a long-lost relative to, in one especially creative version making the rounds, a feud between the funeral home and the cemetery over plot boundaries. None of them had guessed the truth, which was, as truths in Piney Grove so often were, both stranger and more tender than anything the gossip mill had managed to invent. Cal Dupree had asked no questions when Eunice told him the family needed more time. He had nodded in that careful way of his, and given Clover May the dignity of waiting in the magnolia room a little longer, attended to gently, while the living worked out what they owed her. Holt Pickett had arrived, as promised, on a Thursday 3 weeks prior, and had left again 4 days later, considerably less satisfied than he'd hoped. Abigail, true to her word, had made certain his attempts to access Clover May's papers ran headlong into more legal scrutiny than he'd bargained for. Scrutiny that uncovered, among other things, 2 prior instances of Holt quietly advising elderly clients into arrangements that benefited him far more than they did. He had not been charged with anything, but he had been seen, clearly, by people whose seeing mattered, and he had gone back to Tuscaloosa with the particular quiet of a man who understood he'd be watched from now on. He did not attend the funeral. Nobody missed him. Faith Whitlow arrived in Piney Grove on a Friday morning in November, driving down from Montgomery in a sensible gray sedan, her husband Daniel beside her for support. However, he said almost nothing the whole weekend, understanding, as good husbands sometimes do, that this particular territory belonged entirely to his wife. Eunice met her first, alone, at the funeral home, Faith's choice, made over the phone the week before. I'd like to see where she was, Faith had said, before anything else. Before I meet anyone else or hear anyone else's version of any of it, I'd like to just be where she was for a minute. So Eunice walked her into the magnolia room, where Clover May lay in quiet readiness, dressed in the soft blue dress her neighbor had selected, her hands folded over the worn leather Bible that had carried the diary all those years, hidden in plain sight inside the one book nobody in Piney Grove would have thought to search. Faith stood at the casket for a long time without speaking. She drove my mother to Calera, Faith said finally, quietly, not quite a question. The night I was born, she did. She gave me away. She did that too. Eunice stood beside her, hands folded, offering nothing but presents, which she had learned over 51 years was sometimes the only honest thing to offer. And then she spent the rest of her life writing it down because some part of her couldn't let it disappear with her. She wanted to be found out, Faith. She didn't dare to do it while she was breathing. Faith reached out, very gently, and laid her hand on the edge of the casket, not on Clover May, just near her, the way you might touch a door frame before walking through into a room you weren't certain about. I'm not angry, she said, sounding almost surprised by her own words. I thought I would be. I've had 11 days to be angry, and I kept waiting for it, and it just never showed up. Mostly, I feel sad. For her, for my mother, for Mara Lynn, For everybody who spent 50 years too afraid to say the truth out loud when saying it might have given somebody some peace a lot sooner. That's a kind of grace most people don't manage, Eunice said softly. Most people get angry first and work their way to sad. You skipped straight past it. Maybe I'm still working my way there. Faith's eyes were wet, but her voice held. Will you tell me one thing before the service? Anything. Was she a good woman, Clover May? Setting aside all of this, was she good? Eunice considered the question with the care it deserved. She was a complicated woman who made one terrible choice as a young woman and then spent the rest of her life being kind to make up for it in every way she knew how, except the one way that would have actually mattered, Eunice said. She grew the best tomatoes in this town. She never missed a chance to help a neighbor in trouble. And she carried your story so carefully for 50 years that when she finally let it go, she gave it to exactly the people who would handle it gently. She paused. I think that's about as good as most of us manage to be, Faith. I think she was good and she failed you, both at once, the way most people are both things their whole lives. Faith nodded slowly, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. I think I can live with that answer, she said. The funeral itself was small, Faith's choice, and one Eunice respected entirely. No church service, no eulogy delivered to a packed sanctuary of gossip-hungry mourners, just a graveside gathering on a cold, clear Saturday morning. Faith and Daniel, Eunice, Reverend Cohn presiding gently, Rosalie standing a little apart with her hands folded, and, to the quiet astonishment of nearly everyone present, Judge Abigail Mercer, standing at the edge of the small crowd in a plain black coat, present not as a Mercer and not as a judge, but simply as a woman who had decided, finally, to stop looking away. Cohn kept his remarks brief. He did not mention the diary or the Ellards or 50 years of silence. He spoke instead about the nature of secrets, how some are kept out of cruelty, and some out of fear, and some, the saddest kind, out of a love too frightened to know how to say itself out loud. Clover May Pickett, he said, closing his small leather Bible, spent 50 years carrying a truth she didn't dare to speak, but she had the courage in the end to leave a door open for someone else to walk through. That's nothing. In my experience, that's actually quite rare. When the small gathering began to disperse, Faith lingered by the grave a moment longer, then turned and found Abigail standing a few feet away, neither woman quite certain, until that moment, how to approach what they were to each other. You're my aunt, Faith said, not quite a question, testing the word in her mouth. I am, Abigail said, if you'll have one. I understand if you wouldn't want. I don't know what I want yet, Faith said honestly, but I'd like to find out slowly if you're willing to be patient with me. Abigail's careful composure, held so steady through weeks of courtroom hearings, difficult phone calls, and an entire family reckoning conducted largely in private, finally gave way, just slightly, just at the corners of her eyes. I have spent my entire career being patient with other people's complicated truths, she said. I imagine I can manage one more, especially this one. Eunice stood back near the magnolia tree, bare-branched still, waiting on spring, and watched the small cluster of women standing together at the graveside. Faith and Abigail, careful and new with each other, Rosalie, who had broken 30 years of silence to make this moment possible, Reverend Cohn, closing his Bible with the particular peace of a man who'd kept a confidence faithfully and lived to see some good come of the larger truth anyway. She thought of Clover May, lying just a few feet away in the cold November ground, finally, after 50 years, unburdened. All right then, Eunice thought, the same words she'd spoken in the magnolia room the morning this whole thing began. All right. The wind moved through the bare branches above her, patient as it had always been, keeping its own counsel, the way the whole town of Piney Grove always eventually did, until, every so often, it didn't. The message on the right cheek. Butch began. I was only 23 or 24 years old back then, working in the quiet, sterile chill of the embalming room, learning the trade under my daddy. You get used to a lot of things in the funeral business, the quiet, the heavy scent of chemicals, the varied ways the world finally catches up to a man, but this particular case was unlike anything that had ever walked through our doors. The fellow on my porcelain table had been a big deal up in Atlanta. He owned a string of adult bookstores and had recently found himself tangled up with a federal grand jury over pornography being shipped across state lines. The feds wanted him to talk, but somebody else wanted him quiet. They found him dead in the trunk of a rental car parked out at the Atlanta airport. By the time anyone noticed the car, he'd been sitting in that dark trunk for about a day and a half. Naturally, the authorities did an autopsy on him in Atlanta. The funeral director down in Florida, who was supposed to oversee the final arrangements, happened to be an old friend of Daddy's, so the logistics fell to us away from Metro Atlanta in Piney Grove. I drove up, picked him up from the morgue, and brought him back to our prep room to embalm him and get him ready for the trip down south. I was mid-procedure, focused on the work, when the heavy door clicked open. Daddy walked back into the room, his expression unusually tight. He didn't look at the table. He just looked straight at me and said, "Butch, clean yourself up right now and come up to the front office." I washed my hands, pulled off my apron, and walked down the hallway, wondering what kind of trouble had arrived at the front door. Standing in our lobby was a man who seemed to completely alter the room's gravity just by occupying it. He was about 6 feet or 6'1", and his presence, just his sheer company, was overwhelming. He was a nice, pleasant, gray-haired gentleman, but everything about him was mathematically precise. His suit was flawlessly tailored, his tie perfectly knotted, his rings just right, and his fingernails immaculate. He looked at me as I walked in, and his voice, when he spoke, was incredibly soft-spoken, carrying the faint, elegant trace of an old-world accent. "Hello," he said. "Hello, sir," I replied. Daddy stepped forward. "Mr. Hampton tells me you are his son," the gentleman said, his eyes locking onto mine, "and that you are the one embalming Mr. So-and-so." "Yes, sir, I am." The man took a short step closer. "I want to know exactly where he was shot." I didn't hesitate. "Well, sir, he was shot once on the right cheek and 3 times in his chest, perfectly in the form of a triangle." "Are there any other marks on his body?" he asked. "No, sir," I told him. "Nothing other than the normal discoloration you'd expect from a body being left in a closed trunk for a day and a half. But I'll be glad to go back into the room and double-check the skin for you right now." He nodded once, granting permission. I walked back to the embalming room, turned the body over, checked the limbs, and confirmed what I already knew. When I returned to the front office to tell him there weren't any other marks, the man's gaze was waiting for me. He never took his eyes off my face. In the whole time we stood there, I don't think he ever blinked, not even once. He listened to my report, gave a slow, dignified nod, and said, "Thank you, young man." Then he turned and walked out into the afternoon air as quietly as he had arrived. It wasn't until later, after the paperwork was cleared and the body was sent down to Florida, that the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together. We did some digging and researching into the underworld politics of that era. The man on my table had been well thought of in his circles, but because he had been subpoenaed to testify before that grand jury against the very people who built his empire, his fate was sealed. But they hadn't just disposed of him, they had done it specially. The single shot to the right cheek wasn't an accident or a missed aim, it was the kiss of death. The entire hit had been executed to convey a specific, undeniable message to the grand jury, the feds, and anyone else watching. We committed this killing. It was a corporate memo delivered in lead. Yet, in their own twisted code, he was killed respectfully. It was a mob execution handled with a strange kind of criminal sorrow. They hadn't dumped him in a ditch or left him to the elements. They had laid him inside that rental car trunk gently, resting on a nice, clean blanket. I kept up with that federal trial in the newspapers for months afterward. It was a wild, exciting glimpse into a dark world that a boy from a quiet county funeral home usually only reads about in novels. 40 years have passed since I stood in that front office, but I'll never forget the chill of that unblinking gaze, or the immaculate gentleman who came to ensure the message had been properly delivered. The covenant of the Godby Cemetery. If you lived anywhere near Westtown back in those days, you knew that the line between a saint and an outlaw was about as thin as a pine shaving. But even by local standards, the War family was a category all their own. Wright War was a beautiful throwback of a man, a great, big, barrel-chested giant who looked as if he'd been hewn directly from an oak stump. His wife was just as big as he was, and together they had raised 2 massive sons. The boys were simple-minded, what the old folks called half-wits, but they didn't have a single mean bone in their massive frames. They were just gentle, oversized kids navigating a world too small for them. The center of their universe was an old purebred collie. One night, the Warhouse caught fire. The smoke was thick and black before anyone woke up, but that collie went to work, barking and scratching until Wright finally stirred. In his confusion and the blinding smoke, Wright's first instinct was parental frustration. "I'm going to kill that dog," he roared, coughing through the haze. But the moment his feet hit the floor, the heat caught him and dropped him to his knees. He realized the house was fully engulfed. Wright dragged his wife out, went back into the furnace for his two boys, and finally made it to the yard just as the structure collapsed into a mountain of ash. The collie was standing by the tree line, soot-stained and panting. Wright collapsed into the dirt, wrapped his massive arms around that dog, and wept. Right there in the glow of the dying embers, he made a solemn covenant. Dog, as long as I'm alive, you're going to eat what I eat, and you're going to sleep where I sleep. You will want for nothing in this life, and when you die, you will be buried right where I'm buried. The Guardians of the Arch. A few years later, the dog's time came. He grew sick, passed away, and a grieving Wright war marched right into the Piney Grove funeral home to see young Butch Hampton, who was only 23 or 24 years old at the time. "We're going to bury him down in the old God Bay Cemetery," Wright announced. Butch wiped his hands on his apron and felt his stomach drop. "Right, there are some really nice pet cemeteries around the county. We probably need to think about this." To understand Butch's hesitation, you had to understand the Godbey family. They were the undisputed rulers of the dirt road where Old National made the sharp turn into Route 138. Folks said they were cut from the same cloth as the Jesse James gang. If you wanted to cross their land, you paid a toll to older man John Godby. If you refused, they'd beat you half to death, take your boots, and toss you back into your own wagon. They were so mean and argumentative that the family had literally split over a spelling feud, leaving the stone archway at the cemetery entrance carved with Godby on one side and Godby on the other. "That's where the dog is going," Wright insisted. "I've got 4 graves in that lot for me, the wife, and my boys. That's my dirt." "What about John Godby?" Butch asked. "You know, John watches that gate like a hawk. Last year, he stood there with a shotgun and ran the vault company's truck right off the property." "Let me worry about John," Wright said flatly. The prep room metamorphosis. Daddy and Mom had gone out of town for a brief afternoon trip, leaving young Butch alone in the prep room. Butch was a professional, and a promise to a grieving family was law. He brought the massive collie onto the porcelain table. He embalmed him with the same precision he'd use on a governor, gave the thick coat a thorough aromatic shampooing, and was midway through the restoration process when the back door clicked open. Daddy walked into the room, took 3 steps, and froze. There was his 23-year-old son, standing over a flawless, pristine collie, holding a high-powered electric hairdryer, methodically fluffing the dog's golden and white fur into a majestic cloud. Daddy stared at the hairdryer, then at the dog, and then at Butch. He didn't yell, he didn't ask for an explanation, he just cleared his throat and asked, "Is everything all right in here?" "Yes, sir," Butch said, without breaking stride. Daddy slowly closed the door, stepped backward into the hallway, and left him to his work. The Stetson at the gate. Because a standard pet container wouldn't hold a dog of that stature, Butch transferred the collie into a regular little adult casket, the smallest one they carried, though it was still spacious. The War family arrived at the funeral home carrying a grocery bag, tenderly lining the velvet interior with the dog's favorite chew toys and a couple of boxes of milk bones. Butch drove the coach out to the Godby Cemetery, having already sent a crew ahead to dig the grave and drop a small cement vault liner into the red clay. He kept watching the tree line, warning the boys, "If a man named John Godby shows up, you'll know him by the giant Stetson hat pulled low over his eyes. Don't argue with him. Just call me or start running." A small circle of 3 or 4 neighbors gathered around the plot. Dale Hand stepped forward into the quiet afternoon breeze and sang a stirring rendition of Amazing Grace. One of the giant war boys cleared his throat and offered a simple, heartbreaking prayer for the companion that had given them their lives. They were lowering the heavy cement top onto the vault when Butch caught a sudden flash of movement out of the corner of his eye. Walking through the iron archway, his boots crunching deliberately against the gravel, was old man John Godby. The black Stetson was pulled low, his face set like granite. The air went completely still. "Butch!" John rumbled, his voice low and dangerous as he stopped at the edge of the grass. "What are we doing here?" "We are burying some of Wright War's folks, Mr. Godby," Butch said evenly, stepping between the old man and the vault workers. "Who is it?" John demanded. "You'll have to talk to Wright about that, sir." John shifted his unblinking, icy gaze to Wright War, who stood there with tears cutting clean tracks through the soot and dust on his massive cheeks. "Who are you putting in the ground, Wright?" John asked. Wright choked back a sob, his huge shoulders shaking. John, do you remember that old collie dog? The one that barked and pulled my boys out of the fire when our whole house burned to the bedrock? John Godby paused, his eyes narrowing beneath the brim of his hat. Yeah, I remember him. Well, he died, Wright wept openly now, completely uncovered, and I promised him he'd go where I go. We're burying him right here. Butch braced himself for the explosion. He waited for the shotgun, the cursing, or the eviction notice. Instead, a strange, sudden tremor hit older man John Godby's jaw. He pulled off his Stetson hat, held it against his chest, and two massive tears spilled over his weathered eyelids. Damn right, John choked out, his voice cracking into a rough whisper. That's the sweetest thing I've ever heard in my life. Before the funeral crew could even process the shift in the wind, the two old rough-hewn country giants stepped forward and threw their arms around each other, weeping together over a cement vault in the red dirt. Butch climbed back into the hearse a few minutes later, watching the two men walk down the lane side by side. He shook his head, a slow smile touching his face as he cranked the engine. In a town like Piney Grove, you could study human nature for 100 years and still realize the grandest truth of the ministry. You never know what people will do when love gets hold of them. The swing shift at the Piney Grove Funeral Home. We've been seeing a lot of secular services at the funeral home lately. The old ways, the three-stanza hymns, the heavy black drapes, and the somber, terrifying sermons about the afterlife are slowly giving way to something entirely different. People want the truth of a life, not just the protocol of a Sunday morning. But of all the non-traditional departures I've ever overseen, none quite reach the high-flying, swing-dancing heights of Charlie's send-off. Charlie was a character who lived life in the fast lane and apparently didn't care much for the speed limit. He'd been married 3 times, drank his whiskey straight, and had treated the inside of a church sanctuary like it was radioactive. When his time finally came, his kids walked into my office, sat down across from my desk, and laid down the law. Butch, his oldest daughter said, wiping a stray tear, but keeping her jaw firm. Daddy wasn't a churchgoer. He never went to church a day in his life, and there is absolutely no reason for us to stand up there, pretend he was a saint, and be hypocritical about it. We want a service that actually looks like him, and that's going to be it. I told them the Piney Grove Funeral Home was at their service, but even I didn't quite realize what the blueprint entailed. The swing and the sinkers. When the afternoon of the service arrived, the main chapel looked less like a house of mourning and more like a cross between a hardware store and a late-night ballroom. Charlie absolutely loved fishing, so we didn't bother with the traditional cascades of white lilies. Instead, we lined the front of the chapel with his entire collection of fiberglass rods, heavy-duty spinning reels, and hand-tied lures. The scent of embalming fluid was entirely overwhelmed by the distinct metallic aroma of machine oil and lead sinkers. And instead of a pipe organ droning out "In the Garden," we had the sound system cranked up, pumping out vintage, high-energy, big band swing music. Benny Goodman, the Sonny Dorsey Band, the James Band, and Kaiser were blaring through the speakers, making the heavy brass chandeliers vibrate. Now, Piney Grove is a traditional town, and a lot of the folks who showed up were pillars of the local establishment. Men like Clyde Kinnett and Frank Leach, the undisputed leaders of the Christian church, walked in wearing their stiffest Sunday suits. The two Gunnin boys, Charles and Bob, who had held leadership positions in the church since the Eisenhower administration, took their seats near the back, their faces masks of polite, profound confusion, as a Benny Goodman clarinet solo echoed off the walls. Bob Tyler had agreed to serve as the master of ceremonies, mostly because he was the only man in the county with a tuxedo and a voice loud enough to compete with a brass section. He stood by the podium, looking out at the crowd, with a look that suggested he knew a storm was brewing. The entrance of Charlie, the service started lightly. A few family members and old buddies got up to speak, telling wild, hilarious stories about Charlie's misadventures on the lake and his legendary footwork on the dance floor. Nobody wanted to get too serious. They were keeping it honest. But then the music suddenly cut out. A dead, heavy silence dropped over the chapel. Charles Gunnan leaned forward in his pew, bracing himself for what he assumed was the final benediction. Instead, a sharp, crackling sound burst through the speakers, and the joyful, high-pitched bounce of zip-a-dee-doo-dah filled the room. Before anyone could even process the melody, the chapel's side doors flew open. Bouncing out into the aisle, completely in rhythm with the music, was one of the daughter's closest friends. She wasn't wearing black. She was dressed in a full, vibrant clown outfit. Bright red nose, oversized checkered trousers, floppy shoes, and a face covered in stark white and blue grease paint. The congregation gasped. Frank Leach's jaw dropped so low I thought his dentures might give out. The clown didn't care. She came jitterbugging down the center aisle, her oversized shoes squeaking against the carpet, and clutched tightly in her white-gloved hands was Charlie's actual rusted green metal tackle box. The family had decided that a standard brass urn was far too formal for a man who spent his life chasing bass, so they had placed his earthly remains right inside his favorite tackle box, sinkers and all. The final dance. She bounced right up to the front table, doing a little three-step spin in front of the flower arrangements. With a dramatic, theatrical flourish, she lifted the green tackle box high above her red wig, looked right at the stunned crowd, and shouted, "Here's Charlie!" She slammed the tackle box down on the velvet-draped table with a heavy, metallic clank that echoed all the way to the vestibule. Then, without missing a beat, she reached into her oversized pockets, pulled out massive handfuls of saltwater taffy and peppermint drops, and began dancing around the front rows, throwing candy directly into the laps of the mourners. She tossed a piece of bubble gum right into Clyde Kinnett's folded hands. Up at the podium, Bob Tyler didn't say a word. He just leaned over the microphone, his eyes wide as saucers, watching the Gunnin' boys try to duck as a stray piece of butterscotch flew over their heads. By the time the record faded out and the clown gave a final bowing curtsy, the tension in the room had snapped completely. The kids started laughing, then the grandkids, and pretty soon, even old Clyde Kinnett was shaking his head, a slow, helpless grin breaking through his traditional reserve. It was ridiculous and chaotic, and the most honest thing the chapel had seen in years. After the crowd had cleared out and the candy wrappers had been swept up, Bob Tyler walked back into the prep room, where I was putting up the folding chairs. He took off his bow tie, wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead, and looked at me with a grin that stretched from ear to ear. "Butch," Bob said, shaking his head in absolute wonder, "I've been to 1,000 funerals in this valley, but I tell you the truth, I would have paid good, legal tender to see the looks on people's faces when that clown brought Charlie out in that tackle box." I just laughed, locking the side doors. "In our business, you learn to cater to the living just as much as the dead." And as I looked at the little green box sitting on the table, I figured Charlie was probably somewhere up there, dancing a two-step to Benny Goodman, thoroughly pleased that he'd managed to disrupt a church crowd one final time. Fists, fire, and the funeral aisle. When you spend your life running a funeral home, you get a front row seat to human nature when the varnish is completely stripped away. Most folks think grief brings people together, smoothing over the old rough edges out of respect for the dead. But the truth is, a death in the family is like throwing high-octane gasoline onto an old kitchen fire. If there's friction buried in a bloodline, the prep room doors are usually where it busts wide open. We've had our share of minor disagreements over music choices or who gets the family Bible, but now and then, a family arrives that chooses violence before they even sign the register book. The Main Street Melee, back when we were still operating out of the old place up on Main Street, we had a viewing for a local family that I'll never forget. It involved two brothers who had been harboring a bitter, toxic grudge against one another for years. The spark that finally set them off wasn't the loss of their kin, it was a dispute over who would inherit an old farm truck. They started arguing in the foyer, their voices rising over the soft organ music, and before anybody could intervene, they flew at each other right there in the middle of the carpet. It wasn't a gentleman's scuffle, it was a full-blown knockdown fistfight. Within 30 seconds, blows were landing, chairs were flipping, and there was blood splattered all over the wallpaper and the white viewing chairs. Luckily, Brother Tom Jackson, the preacher from Bell Street Baptist Church, was scheduled to do the service. Brother Tom was an old-school, iron-jawed minister who didn't tolerate foolishness inside the house of the Lord or the house of the dead. He marched right into the middle of the clearing, grabbed both brothers by their collars with his massive hands, and literally threw them apart. "Sit down and shut your mouths," Tom roared, his voice echoing off the tin ceiling. He forced one bleeding brother into a pew on the far right side of the aisle and shoved the other one into a pew on the far left. Then, Tom stood right there in the center of the aisle like a stone wall, glaring back and forth between them. "If either one of you says another word or makes a single move," Tom warned, narrowing his eyes, "I will personally whip both of you right now in front of your mother's casket." The old man could have done it too. The brothers sat perfectly still, dripping blood onto their Sunday shirts, staring straight ahead until the final amen was spoken. The Blackburn blaze. But if you think a fight over an old truck on Main Street is bad, it doesn't hold a candle to what happened down in College Park with the Blackburn family. The Blackburns lived in a southwest Atlanta neighborhood, and their story was a tragedy from the start. Both the husband and wife had been previously married, so you had two entirely separate sets of kids, plus their respective spouses and children, all mashed together into one volatile, resentful mix. Now, I don't think I'm out of line to say that the Blackburn elders enjoyed their alcohol. They were famous for throwing rowdy weekend parties that lasted long into the early morning hours. One Saturday night, one of them fell asleep in a recliner while smoking a cigarette. The house caught fire, and by the time the volunteer trucks arrived, the whole place had burned clean to the ground. Both parents perished in the blaze. To make matters worse, there was absolutely no will left behind. The moment the smoke cleared, the kids descended on our funeral home like a pack of starved wolves. They didn't have a lawyer, they didn't have a plan, and they certainly didn't have any money. All they knew how to do was fuss, fight, and accuse each other of causing the fire. Daddy and I could see the train wreck coming from a mile away. We finally managed to corner them in the arrangement office and talked 4 out of the 5 kids into hiring Bob Edwards to handle the legal side of the estate. Daddy told them, "Bob has done a lot of estate work for our families over the years. He's an honest man, and he'll treat you right." The fifth kid wanted absolutely nothing to do with it. He wanted a war. From that moment on, it was a total knockdown, drag-out fight. They were calling our office at all hours of the night, screaming threats at one another. One afternoon, one of the sons called the main desk, breathing heavy, and announced that he was currently driving down the highway with a loaded shotgun to shoot the rest of his siblings right on our front porch. I spent the next 2 hours watching the parking lot out of the corner of my eye. Chaos in the chapel. By the day of the service, the tension inside the chapel was thick enough to choke a mule. The rows were divided by camp, with both sides staring at each other with pure, unadulterated hatred. Dr. Raymond C. Maloney stepped up to the platform to start the service. He was a dignified, holy man who believed in solemn reverence. He opened his Bible, cleared his throat, and began his introductory remarks. He didn't even get through the first scripture. A nephew on one side muttered an insult across the aisle, and within seconds, the front rows erupted into a cacophony of cursing, screaming, and finger-pointing. They were standing on the pews, shouting profanities over the caskets of their own parents. Dr. Maloney stood at the pulpit, his face turning from pale to a deep, disgusted crimson. He looked down at the screaming match, slammed his Bible shut with a thunderous crack, and looked right at the family. "I am a minister of the gospel," Dr. Maloney said, his voice trembling with righteous indignation, "and I cannot have anything more to do with this ungodliness." He turned on his heel and walked right off the platform, leaving the service completely abandoned. The moment the preacher left, the last shred of restraint vanished. One of the Blackburn boys shouted a crude remark at Dr. Maloney's retreating figure, and instantly a brother from the opposing side jumped him from behind. It was an absolute riot. The neighbors and friends who had come to pay their respects were sitting in the back pews with their mouths wide open, utterly paralyzed by the spectacle. People were turning to each other, whispering, "I can't believe how they're acting. We've never seen anything like this." Daddy looked at me from the back of the chapel, and we didn't need to trade words. We've been in the business long enough to know when a situation is entirely unsalvageable. "Load 'em up, Butch," Daddy said. In about 10 minutes, our staff just bypassed the rest of the schedule. We moved in, loaded the caskets back onto the biers, wheeled them straight out the side doors into the waiting hearses, and drove out to the graveyard. We carried them out to the red dirt, lowered them into the ground, and buried them right then and there, while the family was still sorting out their bruises back at the building. It was a sight to behold. The empty ledger. A few weeks later, our old friend Bob Edwards, the lawyer, came by the office to look over the paperwork. He sat in the leather chair, shook his head, and noted that the funeral home hadn't even been paid for the service yet because the dispute entirely froze the family's bank accounts. I sat down across from Bob, and we both just stared out the window at the highway, trying to make sense of the madness. "Bob," I said, shaking my head, "to this day, I cannot figure out what under the sun those kids were fighting over. There wasn't any money, there wasn't any jewelry or insurance. There was nothing left but a vacant, scorched lot where the house used to be, and it was located in a completely average, ordinary neighborhood. They literally wrecked a funeral and threatened to kill each other over a pile of ash." Bob just sighed, capping his pen. "Butch, some families don't need a fortune to fight. They need a reason to let the mean out." 40 years later, I still think about that afternoon whenever a family starts getting loud in the lobby. You can bury the dead and polish the silver, but some mysteries of the human heart are far too deep for a funeral director ever to understand. The hunter in the firing squad. If you handle enough funerals, you learn that military details are the most mathematically precise events in the entire business. There is no freelancing. Every movement is a calculated rhythm of starched fabric, polished brass, and white gloves. The heels click like a pistol shot. The commands are barked in a cadence that hasn't changed since the First World War, and the solemnity is thick enough to hold up a tent. Usually, nothing breaks that rigidity, except for the time we went down to Brooks, Alabama, about 15 years ago. The deceased was a retired master sergeant in the United States Army. He'd grown up around Fayette County, settled near Fort McPherson after his service, an excellent place to retire back then, and eventually moved down to Ellenwood. Our funeral home had held the military transport contract for about 20 years, so when his wife called us, we loaded up the coach and headed down to the country church cemetery behind the woods in Brooks. It was one of those hot, heavy Alabama afternoons where the atmosphere at the graveside was a complicated mix of deep sadness and profound relief. The master sergeant had lived a long, full life, but he'd been fighting the fading light for a while. To make sure the older folks in attendance didn't jump out of their skin when the tribute began, several of the children had quietly gone around the pews beforehand, whispering, "Now don't be scared when the firing squad starts up. It's just the honor guard paying respects." What they didn't account for was the local wildlife. Present arms and the bramble bush. A weathered split rail fence ran directly along the cemetery property line, separating the manicured church grass from a thick, tangled briar patch. The 7-man military detail marched out in perfect synchronized steps, their boots crunching in unison against the gravel path. They lined up parallel to the fence. The young sergeant in charge stepped out front, drew a deep breath, and called the detail to attention. "Detail, Atten Hut." 7 pairs of shiny black low quarters kicked back, their heels snapping together with a loud, crisp clack. The crowd went dead silent. The family leaned forward, handkerchiefs pressed to their eyes. "Present, arms." The rifle swung up in a flawless, blurred arc, catching the mid-afternoon sun. Every soldier was a statue, eyes locked straight ahead onto the horizon, waiting for the command to load the blanks. Right at that exact microsecond of absolute high-stakes military reverence, the briar patch next to the fence rustled. Out popped a massive, fat Alabama cottontail rabbit. Completely oblivious to the United States Armed Forces, the rabbit began casually bouncing right down the clear lane between the soldiers and the split-rail fence. The hardwired reflex. Now, you can take a boy out of the woods and give him advanced tactical training, but you cannot completely erase a lifetime of hunting reflexes hardwired into a South Alabama soul. One of the young privates at the end of the firing line saw that rabbit out of the corner of his eye. Before his brain could consult his military manual, his hunting instincts took the wheel. His rifle drifted off the horizon, his cheek dropped onto the stock, his eye narrowed, and he tracked the bouncing white tail down the fence. In a loud, clear, completely reflexive country drawl, the kid blurted out, "He's mine." A fraction of a second later, the ice-cold horror of what he had just done hit him. The kid froze mid-aim. His face went from pale to a shade of crimson that nearly matched the brick on the church clubhouse. He violently yanked the rifle back up to the sky, went perfectly rigid, and stared straight ahead into the pine trees, sweat visibly breaking out across his forehead. Unglued Grace, the sergeant in charge, looked like he was about to swallow his own whistle, but before he could issue a reprimand, the front row of the funeral tent completely unraveled. The master sergeant's widow let out a loud, sputtering gasp that instantly turned into a full-bellied laugh. The children erupted next, pounding one another on the back, crying tears of absolute, hysterical joy. The laughter rolled from the front row clean back to the cars. The heavy, suffocating cloud of grief that had hung over the cemetery for 2 hours was shattered into 1,000 pieces by a kid who wanted to shoot a rabbit. The family wiped their eyes, and the oldest son stepped out from under the awning and walked past the flustered sergeant straight to the firing line. "Son," the son said, looking at the mortified private who was still standing at rigid attention, trying not to blink. "You don't have any idea how much good that just did us. Our daddy spent half his life in the woods chasing rabbits, and he would have been mad if you didn't aim at that one." The widow walked over next, completely bypassing military protocol, and threw her arms right around the young soldier's starched uniform. She looked back at the sergeant in charge and said, "Don't you dare discipline this boy. That was the finest tribute my husband could have ever asked for." We finished the service, the blanks were fired, and the flag was folded perfectly, but the stiffness was entirely gone from the day. As I drove the hearse back up toward Piney Grove, I couldn't help but chuckle. You can spend thousands of dollars on flowers, music, and eulogies to ease a family's pain. Still, sometimes the Lord sends a wild rabbit and a distracted private to remind everybody that life, even at a grave, has a way of breaking through the somberness. The high-speed benediction of Brother Joe Black. If there was one thing you could count on with the old-school preachers in our valley, it was their rhythm. They had a cadence for the pulpit, a cadence for the covered dish dinners, and a very specific, dignified tempo reserved exclusively for the graveside committal. But nobody in the entire county possessed a more formidable command of the English language than old preacher Joe Black. Brother Joe was a prince of precision. He didn't just speak, he enunciated. He treated every single consonant like a piece of fine crystal, and he viewed a dropped G at the end of a working verb as a personal affront to the Almighty. When Joe Black said the word righteousness, you could hear the structural timbre in the syllables. He was a small, wireframe man who always wore a perfectly pressed black suit, a high white collar, and shoes polished to such a high mirror shine that you could check your tie reflection in his toes. The solemnity at Noah's Ark. We had a service one afternoon over at Noah's Ark. Now, Noah's Ark wasn't a boat. It was an old, remote country cemetery tucked deep into the cedar thickets on the county line. It was a beautiful, wild place, but because the trustees only mowed it about 3 times a summer, the fescue and the wild blackberry brambles grew thick and heavy right up to the edges of the family plots. It was exactly the kind of place where you wanted to watch your step. We had just finished the chapel service and driven the coach out to the cemetery. The family was seated under the canvas tent, the wind was rustling low through the cedars, and everything was proceeding with the quiet, heavy solemnity that Daddy and I always aimed for. Spanky, our dependable vault and ground foreman, was standing a few yards back by the lowering device, holding the green grass carpets in place, waiting for the final cue to lower the casket. Brother Joe Black took his position right at the head of the grave, standing flat-footed on the earth, holding his small leather New Testament in his left hand. He adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat with a crisp, authoritative pop, and began the final remarks. "We are gathered here today," Joe Black intoned, his voice rolling out across the tombstones with beautiful, measured majesty, "to commit the earthly remains of our dear brother to the bosom of the red clay." Shifting gears, he was about 3 minutes into a beautifully drafted prayer when I noticed a sudden, subtle change in his posture. Brother Joe didn't move his upper body, but his left heel twitched. Then his right toes clamped down inside his polished leather shoe. He stopped mid-sentence, his eyes widening just a fraction behind his spectacles. Now, normally, Joe Black would pause for dramatic effect, letting a theological point hang in the air like sweet tea, but he didn't pause this time. Instead, the legalistic precision of his vocabulary suddenly collided with a high-speed locomotive. He shifted gears into a tempo that I didn't think the human lungs were biologically capable of sustaining. "The Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away," Brother Joe barked, the syllables running together like a flock of startled quail. "Ashes to ashes, dust to dust, blessed be the name of the Lord go in peace, and may the Holy Spirit keep your Sue El Shun till the day of glory. Amen." He didn't even wait for the family to look up from their handkerchiefs. The microsecond the N in Amen cleared his teeth, the old preacher practically launched himself off the mound. He didn't walk. He executed a high-speed, stiff-legged march straight past the front row, blew right through the funeral directors, and descended upon the edge of the clearing like a man who had left his oven on at home. The Linguistic Report. He marched straight up to Spanky, who was still holding the vault straps, staring at the preacher in absolute mouth-open bewilderment. Brother Joe stopped exactly 2 inches from Spanky's nose, even though his heart was clearly hammering against his ribs and his chest was heaving for oxygen. He refused to let his elocution slip. He gathered his composure, drew himself up to his full, narrow height, and delivered his report with the exact, crystal-clear diction of a radio announcer. "Spanky!" Brother Joe whispered, his voice perfectly crisp and entirely unbothered by syntax. "I was standing on a snake there." Spanky blinked. "A snake, preacher?" "A copperhead, Spanky," Joe Black clarified, his eyes perfectly round behind his lenses. "A substantial, multi-patterned reptile of the pit." My left heel was pinned firmly against its midsection for the duration of the second scriptural reading. I felt the creature rotate beneath my soul. "Spanky, had I lifted my foot to emphasize the resurrection, I am entirely convinced the judgment would have been immediate." Spanky didn't say a word. He just grabbed a shovel, walked back over to the head of the grave, and flipped over the edge of the green artificial grass carpet. Sure enough, a 4-foot-long country copperhead was slithering frantically out of the packed dirt, thoroughly insulted by the weight of the Baptist ministry. By the time we got the family loaded back into their cars, the story had already outrun the hearse. I walked back over to the church van, where Joe Black was sitting in the passenger seat, methodically wiping his polished shoes down with a handkerchief to remove any trace of the cemetery dust. "You did some fine preaching today, Brother Joe," I chuckled, leaning against the door frame. "I don't think I've ever heard the committal service delivered with such spiritual urgency." Joe Black capped his fountain pen, set it neatly into his coat pocket, and looked up at me with his signature, unblinking precision. "Butch," he said dryly, "the scripture commands us to be instant in season and out of season, but it also tells us that the serpent shall bruise our heel. I merely decided that today was an excellent afternoon to beat the translation to the punch." "Thanks, Butch. We know you are the last one to let us down in Piney Grove."